She found $500,000 that wasn't supposed to exist. Now, the most dangerous man in New York can't stop thinking about her. If you've ever felt invisible your whole life, like no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you gave, the world just looked straight through you, then this story is for you. Because Alara Voss spent 28 years making herself disappear. And then one night, in a rain-soaked warehouse in Brooklyn, she found something buried in the numbers that was never meant to be found. And the man who owned those numbers? He found her right back. Stay with us until the very end. If this story reaches you, if it makes your chest tighten and your breath catch, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's begin. The rain had been coming down for 3 hours straight by the time Alara Voss realized she was the only person left in the building. She hadn't noticed at first. That was the thing about being the kind of person she was, the kind who sat in the back corner of open-plan offices with a monitor angled just enough to block eye contact, who ate lunch at her desk with headphones in even when nothing was playing, who wore the same rotating selection of oversized wool sweaters in colors that didn't attract light. She was the kind of person whose departure nobody tracked and whose arrival nobody marked, and that invisibility had always felt like a gift, like armor. Now, alone at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in November, with the rain hammering the industrial skylights of Belladonna. Trading's third-floor accounting wing and every other desk dark and empty around her, it felt like something else. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and stared at the spreadsheet. The numbers didn't lie. That was the first thing they taught you in forensic accounting, the foundational truth that made the whole discipline worth anything. Numbers didn't lie. People lied. Systems lied. Paperwork lied with extraordinary creativity and commitment. But underneath all of it, buried beneath layer after layer of fabrication, the numbers always told the truth if you knew how to listen. Alara knew how to listen. She had been running a routine audit on Belladonna Trading's import accounts, a quarterly reconciliation that should have taken 4 hours and produced nothing of interest, when she found it. Or rather, when she found the shape of it. The specific negative space left behind when $500,000 moves through a system and somebody cleans up after themselves but doesn't quite clean up well enough. The first anomaly was small. A rounding discrepancy in a shipping manifest tied to a container that had arrived at the Red Hook terminal in September. $47,000, logged against a cargo line that didn't match its declared contents. Alara had flagged it mentally and kept moving because single discrepancies happened. Clerical errors happened. Lazy bookkeeping happened constantly in import businesses, especially ones that moved the volume Belladonna moved across Brooklyn's waterfront. But then there was a second one and a third. By 9 o'clock, she had found 6 separate anomalies across 4 months of records, each one individually explainable, each one tied to a different cargo line and a different port of entry and a different set of paperwork. But when she laid them side by side, not in the accounting software where they were designed to be viewed, but in a simple spreadsheet she'd built from scratch in a separate window, stripped of all the formatting and cross-references and categorization, they formed a pattern. A clean, deliberate, mathematically precise pattern that could only have been constructed by someone who understood exactly how Belladonna's accounting system worked. Someone who understood it the way Alara understood it. She sat back and pressed her knuckles against her mouth. $512,000. Siphoned across 16 separate transactions over the course of 4 months. Routed through what appeared to be legitimate shipping costs but weren't. Absorbed into operational expense categories where they were unlikely to draw attention unless someone was doing exactly what Alara was doing right now. Sitting alone in an empty office at midnight with the rain coming down and all the noise of the building stripped away, looking at everything as if it were evidence rather than paperwork. The question that sat in front of her was very simple and very terrifying. What did she do now? She could close the spreadsheet. She could finalize the routine audit report with no additional flags, email it to the department head in the morning, and never look at the anomalies again. That was option 1. Alara stared at the rain-blurred glass of the windows and thought about that option for a long time. It had a clean simplicity to it, a survivability. The people who worked at Belladonna Trading were not the kind of people you brought financial irregularities to without understanding exactly what you were walking into. The owner of Belladonna Trading was not the kind of man you surprised with uncomfortable discoveries. Roman DeLuca was 29 years old and had run the DeLuca crime syndicate for 18 months since his father's death, with the kind of cold administrative efficiency that had reportedly shocked men twice his age who'd expected grief to make him vulnerable. He had grown the organization's legitimate business holdings, Belladonna Trading being the largest and most visible, while simultaneously tightening his grip on every criminal operation his father had built over 3 decades. He was young and precise, and he did not tolerate disorder. Alara had been hired through a legitimate staffing agency 14 months ago. She had never met him. She had seen him exactly 3 times. Once in the lobby, once through a glass conference room wall during a meeting she wasn't part of, once at the loading dock when she'd stayed late, and he'd arrived in a black car with 2 men she didn't recognize. He was tall. He was dark-haired. He had a stillness about him that she associated irrationally with the kind of large animals you weren't supposed to make eye contact with. She had been very careful, in 14 months, to never make eye contact. Option 1. Close the spreadsheet. Go home. Sleep. Alara looked at the numbers. The thing was, and this was the thing she couldn't get past, the thing that made option 1 feel like a door she couldn't actually open. The money hadn't been stolen from Roman DeLuca's criminal operation in any way that Alara could directly prove. It had been stolen from the legitimate business, from Belladonna Trading, from the company she worked for, whose financial records she was responsible for, whose audit she was currently completing. If the annual external audit found this, and a competent external auditor would find this, because Alara had found it, the questions wouldn't stop at the accounting department. They would travel upward. They would land on the company's owner, and they would be asked by people with badges and subpoenas rather than people with wool sweaters and quiet voices. And then Roman DeLuca would have a very serious problem. Her chest felt tight, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour or the loneliness. She recognized the sensation. It was the particular suffocation of knowing that every available path forward was dangerous, and that not choosing was also a choice. She saved the spreadsheet to an encrypted personal drive she kept on a keychain in her bag. She made 2 copies. She closed the accounting software, shut down her workstation, and pulled on her coat, a long charcoal wool coat she'd bought 2 winters ago because it was the kind of coat that made you look like furniture. She was almost to the stairwell door when she heard the elevator. The building's main elevators didn't run after 10 on weeknights. She knew this because she stayed late often enough to have learned the building's rhythms. The cleaning crew came at 9 and left by 10:15. The security desk in the lobby was staffed by a single overnight guard who spent most of his shift watching something on his phone. The freight elevator at the building's north end ran on a separate system and had a key override. It was the freight elevator she was hearing now, the low mechanical groan of it rising through the building's bones. On a Tuesday night in November at 11:56, with the rain coming down hard enough to blur the waterfront lights, Alara stopped. She did not move toward the stairwell door. Instead, some animal part of her that operated below rational thought took 3 quiet steps sideways, behind the partition wall that separated the accounting wing from the corridor, and stood very still in the dark. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor. She heard voices. Not many. 2, maybe 3. Low and brief, the kind of exchange that wasn't a conversation but a confirmation. Then footsteps in the corridor, moving with the particular flat efficiency of men who knew exactly where they were going. Her office, the accounting wing, was at the far end of the corridor, past the glass-walled conference room, past the locked door to financial record storage, past the open break room with the fluorescent light that buzzed on a motion sensor. The footsteps stopped. She heard the break room light buzz on. Then a voice, low and unhurried, that she had never heard directed at her personally, but had carried in her peripheral awareness for 14 months, the way you carried the sound of a smoke alarm. Something you didn't think about until you suddenly thought about nothing else. There's a light on in accounting. A pause. Check it. Alara pressed herself flat against the partition wall and stopped breathing. The footsteps resumed, closer now, and she heard a second set following, heavier, deliberate, and the soft mechanical sound of the break room light clicking off as they moved out of its range. The accounting wing had a glass door. She had left her monitor on standby, not fully dark, and the pale glow of it threw the faintest blue-gray light into the corridor through the glass. Enough light to see that someone had been working. The accounting wing door opened. She heard them come in. 2 sets of footsteps crossing the carpet, moving through the rows of desks. She heard the creak of her chair, her specific chair, the one she'd adjusted to the precise height that stopped her neck from aching, as someone sat in it and woke her monitor from standby. Someone was running an audit, the first voice said. Not alarmed. Observational. The tone of a man cataloging information. After hours? A second voice, rougher, skeptical. Voss, the first voice said. Alara Voss, that's her workstation. Alara's stomach dropped 6 inches. A longer pause. The sound of the mouse moving, someone navigating her screen. She had closed everything before she left the desk. The accounting software was shut down. The personal spreadsheet was saved to the drive on her keychain, not to the workstation. The screen would show only her desktop and the closed programs. Gone, the second voice said. Not long ago. Another pause. Tell Caruso to pull the building exit log. She was already moving. Not toward the stairwell near the accounting wing. That was too close. They would hear the door. She moved in the opposite direction, deeper into the accounting wing, past the last row of desks, toward the narrow door at the far end that connected to the internal mail corridor. It was a door that most people on the floor didn't know existed because it wasn't on the standard floor plan distributed to employees. Alara knew it existed because she had spent 3 weeks during her first month at Belladonna walking every floor of the building in her lunch breaks, the way she walked every new environment, methodically, quietly, memorizing exits. She pushed through the mail corridor door without making a sound and let it close behind her. The corridor was dark and smelled of cardboard and machine oil and the particular institutional mustiness of a space nobody thought about. She moved through it by memory, one hand trailing the wall, until she reached the service stairwell at the building's south end. This stairwell didn't connect to the lobby. It emptied into the loading bay, which connected to the rear parking structure, which had an exit onto a side street that ran parallel to the waterfront. She took the stairs fast. Not running. Running made noise, and noise was the one thing she couldn't afford. Walking fast, heel to toe, hand flat on the railing for balance in the dark. She came out into the loading bay, cold air like a wall hitting her face. The rain was coming in sideways under the bay's corrugated awning. Her coat was immediately soaked across the shoulders. She didn't stop. She moved through the parked delivery vehicles, between 2 container trucks, and out through the rear gate that the overnight crew left on a manual latch, rather than electronic lock because the electronic mechanism had been broken for months, and nobody had submitted the maintenance request. She knew about the latch because she'd seen the maintenance request sitting in the facility's inbox for 11 weeks. She noticed things. That was her specific curse and her specific competency. She noticed everything, cataloged everything, and couldn't turn it off. The side street was empty in the rain. She walked 2 blocks before she found a cab. She didn't go home. She went to her friend Danny's apartment in Park Slope. Her only real friend, a woman she'd met in graduate school who asked few questions and kept an extra key under the third planter on her fire escape, and let herself in and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and her wet coat still on, and her keychain clenched in both hands. She sat there for a very long time. She did not sleep. By morning, she had made her decision. Not a brave decision. Alara had never in her life made a decision out of bravery. She made it out of the same cold accountant's calculus that she applied to everything. The assessment of risks, the comparison of outcomes, the identification of the least catastrophic available path. The least catastrophic available path, as she saw it, was to go back to work, to act as if nothing had happened. To complete the audit, flag the discrepancies through the proper internal reporting channel, which at Belladonna meant taking it directly to the financial oversight officer, a man named Gerald Price, who was 61 and cautious and deeply uninterested in causing anyone trouble, and to let the company's internal process determine what happened next. This was not courageous. She knew it wasn't courageous. But courage had never been her operational mode, and she told herself that navigating through the structure that existed rather than around it was the professional and reasonable thing to do. She told herself this all the way through Danny's bathroom, through borrowed dry clothes, through the coffee she made in Danny's kitchen, through the 40-minute subway ride back to Red Hook. She told herself this right up until she walked through Belladonna Trading's front lobby, said good morning to the security desk, and found Roman DeLuca standing in her office. I was standing beside her window. The small window that faced the waterfront, the one she sometimes opened in summer to let the salt air in, with his hands in his trouser pockets and his attention on the loading docks below. He wasn't looking at her. He didn't appear to have heard her come in. He simply stood there in a dark suit that cost more than her monthly rent, watching the dock workers move cargo in the gray morning light, as if he had all the time in the world. She stopped in the doorway. He turned. His eyes were dark. She'd expected dark. She'd seen him from a distance enough times to know that, but the directness of them at close range was different from what she'd prepared for. He looked at her the way people didn't look at her. Not through her. Not past her. Not at the space she occupied without really registering the person in it. He looked at her like she was a specific problem he was trying to correctly identify, and the quality of that attention was so unusual that her first instinct, embarrassingly, was to look behind herself to see if someone else had come in. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was the same one she'd heard through the glass partition the night before. Of course it was. She'd known that the moment she'd heard it, and she'd filed the knowledge away in the part of her mind where she stored things that were too dangerous to examine closely. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. That was muscle memory. 28 years of practicing the appearance of calm. He didn't move from the window. He regarded her with that same precise attention, like he was reading something written in a language he knew but hadn't spoken in a while. "Close the door," he said. She did. "You were here last night." "I was finishing a quarterly audit," she said. "I often work late. Until midnight." The reconciliation took longer than expected. He studied her. She studied the wall behind him, which was the professional and survival-oriented thing to do. On her desk, her workstation was exactly as she'd left it. Nothing had been moved. Either whoever had been in her office the night before had been very careful, or they hadn't searched her desk. "Gerald Price," he said, "doesn't receive audit reports until they're finalized and approved by the department head." She said nothing. This was not a question. "The department head is out of office for the rest of this week. You would know that." "I'm aware." "So your report wouldn't move through the system until he returns." He tilted his head slightly. "What did you find, Miss Voss?" The question landed in the room like a weight. Not aggressive. That was what made it terrifying. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a man who was accustomed to asking questions once and receiving honest answers, and the expectation in the room was very clear, and Alara stood very still inside it and thought very fast. She could lie. She was a competent liar when she had preparation time. She did not have preparation time. She could partially lie, admit to finding the rounding discrepancies, frame them as minor, describe a plan to address them through standard channels. Or she could do the thing that every instinct she possessed was screaming at her not to do, which was to tell a man she did not know, who ran a criminal organization, who was standing in her office at 8:40 in the morning with the particular stillness of someone who already knew more than he was letting on, to tell him exactly what she'd found. She thought about the spreadsheet on her keychain. She thought about the voice she'd heard in the dark saying her name. She thought about the fact that she was already in this, had been in it since the moment she'd found the pattern in the numbers, and that the degree to which she was in it had nothing to do with what she chose to say in the next 30 seconds, and everything to do with what she'd already done. $512,000, she said, siphoned across 16 transactions over 4 months, routed through legitimate shipping cost categories in a way that would survive casual review, but not a detailed reconciliation. She paused. Someone with intimate knowledge of your accounting architecture constructed this. It's not external. It's internal. The room was very quiet. Roman DeLuca looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A small change in the set of his mouth, something that might have been, in another man, the beginning of surprise. He looked at her like she'd moved in a direction he hadn't predicted. "Sit down, Miss Voss," he said, and his voice was the same as before, not louder, not harder, but the repetition of it changed the room's architecture entirely. She sat. He moved from the window then, crossing to the chair on the opposite side of her desk in the way of a man who understood instinctively that sitting put two people on more even ground than standing over someone. He sat. He rested one forearm on her desk and looked at her spreadsheet, the one that had been open on her screen. No, not her spreadsheet, the standard audit template. She'd closed her personal work before leaving. "Walk me through it," he said. "Excuse me?" "The transactions. Walk me through them." She hesitated for only a second. Then she pulled her keyboard toward her, opened the accounting software, and began. It took 40 minutes. She showed him the anomalies one at a time, explained the routing, the categorization patterns, the specific language used in the falsified shipping descriptions that indicated someone who'd studied the system's labeling conventions. She did it the way she did everything, methodically, without embellishment, without the nervous verbal padding that most people inserted into uncomfortable professional conversations. She explained the numbers because the numbers were what she knew, and she was on surer ground inside them than anywhere else in the world. He didn't interrupt. He watched the screen and occasionally asked a question, brief, precise questions that revealed a faster grasp of financial architecture than she'd expected. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You found this in a routine quarterly reconciliation, he said. Yes. It wasn't flagged by the system. No. It was designed to avoid flags. The amounts were kept under internal review thresholds. The categories were plausible. The timing was spread across quarter boundaries, so no single review period showed a significant anomaly. She paused. Whoever constructed it knew your review protocols. How many people have access to the review protocols? In accounting, 7. In financial oversight, 3. In executive administration, she stopped. I don't have visibility into who else has access at the executive level. His jaw tightened slightly. That was the only visible sign of what the information was doing to him. The slight tightening along the jaw, a single controlled exhale through the nose. He was very good at stillness. It was the kind of stillness that took a long time to build, or that you were born with, or that you acquired through necessity. She didn't know which kind his was. This stays between us, he said. You don't report to Price. You don't report to anyone. You continue your regular work and you speak to no one about what you found. He stood. I'll need everything you've compiled. I haven't compiled anything official. He looked at her. The audit is still in progress, she said carefully. Nothing has been formally documented. Whatever you have, he said, informally, on whatever personal system you're keeping it on. The keychain in her bag weighed approximately nothing and felt, in that moment, like it weighed 40 pounds. I'll need to review that first, she said. What you intend to do with it? The silence that followed that sentence was of a different quality than the silences that had come before it. It had a texture to it. The specific texture of a moment where someone says something unexpected and the person they said it to is recalibrating. Roman DeLuca looked at her with those direct, unreadable eyes for long enough that she had to remind herself not to look away. You'll need to review it, he repeated. Not mocking. Something else she couldn't name. I found the anomaly, she said. I documented it. I'm the one with the professional exposure here if this becomes a legal matter. I'd like to understand the context before I hand over evidence. Evidence. That's what it is. He stood very still. She sat very still. The rain had started again outside the window. She could hear it on the glass. And the loading docks below were mostly empty in the gray morning, and somewhere down the hall a phone rang twice and stopped. No one talks to me like that, he said. Not threatening, genuinely observational. I'm not trying to be difficult, she said. I'm trying to understand what I'm involved in. You're already involved in it. I know. She held his gaze, or tried to, because holding Roman DeLuca's gaze was approximately like holding a lit match and waiting to see which gave first. That's why I'm asking. Another pause. Then something happened in his expression that she couldn't fully decode. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration, a shift in how he was reading her, like she had moved one category over in whatever filing system he used for people. I'm going to find who did this, he said, quietly, without involving the legal system. When I find them, there will be a resolution that doesn't go through courts. She understood what he was telling her. She didn't ask him to clarify. And my position here? She said. Your position here is safe. He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her over his shoulder. You're very good at this. She didn't respond. The numbers, he said. You're very good at the numbers. I know, she said. He almost smiled. She wasn't certain. It happened, and then it was over too fast to verify. He left. She sat in the chair he'd vacated for approximately 4 minutes, not moving, listening to the building's sounds rebuild themselves around the departure of a specific gravity. Then she opened her bottom desk drawer, took out the small bottle of antacid she kept there, and took 2. The days that followed were strange in the specific way that only suspended danger could produce, a combination of acute prickling awareness and forced normalcy that required more energy than it appeared to from the outside. Ilara went to work. She ran her reports. She sat in her corner of the accounting wing with her headphones in, and her monitor angled and did the particular invisible professional performance she'd perfected over a decade of making sure nobody had a reason to think about her. except that Roman DeLuca had a reason to think about her now. He came back to her office on Thursday. Not early morning this time, mid-afternoon, unannounced, appearing in her doorway with the same unhurried precision as before, and asking a question about a secondary anomaly she'd mentioned, a discrepancy in the September container manifest that she'd briefly described during their initial conversation. She had a feeling he'd remembered every word she'd said in that 40-minute walkthrough, and had gone through it later with the focus of someone trying to find a loose thread. She walked him through the September data. He asked sharp, specific questions. She answered them. He came back Friday afternoon with another question. By the following Wednesday, she had begun, with the involuntary exactness of a woman who noticed everything, to notice him. Not in the way she'd noticed him before, peripherally, cautiously, the way you notice something that required distance to be safe, but specifically. The way he held tension in his shoulders when the conversation moved toward the financial infrastructure in ways that implied personal knowledge. The way he went very quiet when she identified something new, that particular quality of stillness that wasn't disengagement, but the opposite. The way he looked at her work, her actual analytical work, the spreadsheets and the documentation and the logical reconstruction of how the money moved, with a focused attention that had nothing in it of condescension. She was accustomed to men who worked in money and power, looking at forensic accountants the way they looked at tax attorneys. Useful, boring, necessary, interchangeable. Tools with good professional liability insurance. Roman DeLuca looked at her work like it was a form of intelligence he respected. She did not know what to do with that. She was still trying to figure out what to do with it. On a Wednesday evening 2 weeks after their first meeting, when she heard the first gunshot, she was working late again. She almost always worked late on Wednesdays because the week's shipping reconciliations came in, and the volume of data required time she didn't have during the standard workday. The accounting wing was empty except for her. The building had its night rhythms. She was deep inside a container manifest from the Newark terminal when she heard it. A single sharp crack that her urban-trained ears placed immediately, not as a car backfiring, not as construction, but as what it actually was. She heard shouting next. From below. From the loading area. Then the building's alarm system went off, and all the lights went out. The emergency lighting kicked in after 3 seconds. Dim red strips along the floor edges, barely enough to see by. And Alara was already on her feet, her bag on her shoulder, her body moving on the same animal instinct that had taken her to the mail corridor 2 weeks ago. She was already at her desk drawer pulling out the small flashlight she kept there. She kept a flashlight there because she kept emergency items in every workspace she occupied, had done since she was 12 years old, because she'd grown up in the kind of household that taught you not to assume the lights would stay on. More shots now. Multiple, rapid, from somewhere in the building below. She heard glass breaking. Then what she identified, after a frozen second, as boots on the stairwell. Not the service stairwell at the far end, the main stairwell, the closer one, the one that came up from the loading bay. Coming up. Alara turned off the flashlight. She moved in the dark. The accounting wing had 3 exits. The main glass door into the corridor, the mail corridor door at the far end, and a small emergency exit window that opened onto the fire escape on the building's east face. The window was the smallest and the most difficult, and she'd never once used it, but she knew exactly where it was and how the latch worked because she had spent 3 weeks memorizing this building's exits, and this was the precise situation that had made her do that. She was halfway across the wing, moving between desks by memory, when the corridor door burst open, not Roman's men. She couldn't have said how she knew that. A reading of the body language, the energy, the way they came through the door with weapons raised rather than with the particular proprietary purpose of men who belonged in a space. 2 of them, dark clothing, faces covered. They had flashlights attached to their weapons. The beams swept across the empty desks. She was behind the last partition, flat against it, not breathing. One of the flashlight beams moved toward her end of the wing. She calculated the distance to the emergency exit window. 20 feet. The latch required 2 hands in a specific sequence. Push, twist left, lift. In the dark. With 2 armed men 3 rows of desks away. The light swept closer. She was going to make it, or she wasn't, and she'd always known, on some deep cold level, that she wasn't the kind of person whose choices didn't catch up with them eventually. The light stopped. A phone buzzed somewhere. One of the armed men had a phone buzzing in his pocket. A voice, terse, in a language she didn't recognize. Then a response, equally terse. The flashlight swung away from her end of the wing. Both men turned toward the corridor door. She heard them leave. She stood there in the dark, shaking in a way that started in her hands and moved outward, and forced herself to count to 5 before she moved. Then she covered the 20 feet to the emergency exit window in 12 seconds, worked the latch by feel in the dark, push, twist left, lift, and push the window open into the freezing rain. She got one leg over the sill. Below her, the fire escape descended in zigzagging metal sections toward the alley between the building and the adjacent warehouse. She could see emergency lights somewhere at street level. She could hear shouting, still muffled by walls, and what might have been more gunfire from somewhere in the building's interior. She got her second leg over the sill. "Miss Voss," the voice came from directly behind her, not the men with the flashlights. This voice she knew. She went completely still, one foot on the fire escape landing and one hand on the window frame, rain soaking through her coat in seconds. "Come back inside," Roman DeLuca said from somewhere in the dark of the accounting wing. His voice was controlled and quiet, and she could hear something underneath it that she hadn't heard in any of their previous conversations. She turned her head. I was standing 10 feet away, visible in the faint glow from the city that came through the window she'd just opened. He wasn't alone. There was a man behind him, one of the two she'd occasionally seen at a distance as part of his security. But his eyes were on her, and in the thin rain-reflected light she could see something on the side of his face that might have been blood. "There are men in this building who are not finished looking for you," he said, still in that same controlled, quiet voice. "The fire escape is where they'll expect you to be." She looked at the fire escape. She looked at him. "Come back inside," he said. "Now." She pulled herself back through the window. He crossed to her in 4 steps and gripped her arm. Not roughly, not gently, a functional grip, the grip of someone moving another person with speed and purpose, and pulled her toward the mail corridor door. "There's a car on the south side," he said low and fast. "We move through the service stairwell, and we don't stop." "What's happening?" she said. "Later." "How many?" "Later, Miss Voss." They moved through the dark mail corridor at a speed that she could barely maintain without her heart climbing out of her chest, and she was aware of the man behind them watching their rear, and she was aware of the building around them as a living, dangerous thing with unknown hostiles moving through it, and she was aware, with the small, cold part of her that never fully stopped noting and filing and processing, that Roman DeLuca's hand on her arm was the first time in a long time that anyone had held on to her like she was something that needed to be kept. They hit the service stairwell. 2 floors below, she heard boots on metal. Roman's grip tightened. He moved her past the 2nd floor landing and kept going, and the man behind them made a sound she didn't understand but clearly constituted a warning. And then there was a sound she had already learned tonight and recognized immediately. A shot, above them now, from the direction they'd come. And Roman shoved her through the loading bay door, and they ran. The black car was exactly where he'd said it would be. She got in. The door slammed. The car moved before she'd finished breathing. She pressed her back against the seat and looked at Roman DeLuca in the seat beside her, at the cut along his jaw that was definitely blood now, at the controlled tight set of his face that she now understood was what he looked like when things were going wrong, and he was refusing to acknowledge that they were going wrong. She'd found $500,000 that wasn't supposed to exist, and now she was in a car with the man it belonged to, running from men she didn't know, toward a destination she hadn't been told. And the terrible specific knowledge that was settling into her chest, the kind of knowledge that arrived not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of a column that finally balanced, was that she had no idea whose side she was on, or whether, at this point, it made any difference. The car didn't have a destination she'd been told about, and nobody in it seemed inclined to explain. Roman sat with his elbow against the door and 2 fingers pressed to the cut along his jaw, not applying real pressure, just touching it the way you touch something to confirm it was still there. The man in the passenger seat, mid-40s, thick through the neck, a face that had been broken and reset at least once, had his phone out and was talking in low, rapid sentences that Alara couldn't fully follow. Another man drove. Nobody spoke to her. She sat in the middle of the back seat and counted her own breaths and watched the Brooklyn waterfront slide past the rain-blurred windows. 14 months at Belladonna Trading. 14 months of careful, studied invisibility. Of arriving on time and leaving quietly and producing clean work and giving nobody a reason to think about her. 14 months of learning the building's rhythms and keeping her head down and being, in every way that mattered, the most forgettable person in every room she occupied. And here she was. She pressed her thumbnail into the leather of her bag strap and held it there until the sharp edge of pain organized her breathing. "Where are we going?" she said. Roman didn't look at her. "Somewhere safe." "Safe for who?" He looked at her then. The car's interior was mostly dark, lights from passing streets strobing across his face in intervals, lit, dark, and in those brief illuminated moments she could read the exhaustion underneath the control, the specific tightness around his eyes that meant he was managing more information than he was displaying. "For you," he said. "Right now." Right now implies that might change. Most things change. She looked out the window. They were moving north, off the waterfront, into streets she recognized less well. Was that Vincent Rizzo's people? The man in the passenger seat stopped talking into his phone. A small, significant pause. "Where did you hear that name?" Roman said. "People talk in offices," she said. "Even to people they don't think are listening." Roman studied her for a moment. The car turned onto a bridge approach, and the city opened up on both sides, water below, towers ahead, and the rain hit the windows with more force out here in the open air above the river. "Yes," he said. "Rizzo's people. They were looking for me specifically. They were looking for anyone connected to my operations. You were there. One of them said my name," she said, "in the accounting wing. Before you came in, one of them said my name. That landed." She watched it land. The almost imperceptible shift, the stillness that went a fraction deeper, like a system recalculating. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He turned to the front. "Caruso." The man in the passenger seat lowered his phone. "Yeah." "How long has Rizzo had people inside our building?" Caruso's jaw tightened. "We're working on that." "That's not what I asked." "I know what you asked." Caruso's voice had the particular flatness of a man who was angry about being the one in the room who didn't have a good answer. "I'm telling you we don't have a timeline yet. We're pulling security footage." "She says they knew her name." A beat. Caruso turned just enough to look at Alara over his shoulder. It was not a warm look. It was the look of a man who was deciding how much of a problem she represented. "Rizzo's been watching the building for weeks," he said, finally. "If they ran surveillance on the staff, they'd have names." "From surveillance," Roman said. "That's my best read." "Your best read." "Roman. Get me a better one." Roman turned back to the window. The bridge ended. Manhattan absorbed them, the streets narrower and brighter and more chaotic, and the car moved through it without hesitation. A route the driver knew well, turning without direction from anyone, which told Alara this was not an improvised journey. They'd been heading somewhere specific from the moment they'd left the loading bay. She thought about the drive. She thought about the cut on Roman's jaw, about the sound of boots on the stairwell above them, about the two armed men in her office sweeping their flashlights across the desks, where she had spent 14 months making herself invisible. She thought about the spreadsheet on her keychain. She thought about the fact that whoever had stolen $512,000 from Belladonna's accounts had constructed a system that required intimate knowledge of the company's financial architecture. She thought about the fact that Rizzo's people had been watching the building for weeks. And she thought, with the specific cold clarity that arrived when her brain stripped away the emotional noise and started working the problem, about what it meant that those two facts existed in the same time frame. The car stopped. She looked up. A parking structure, underground, the kind attached to a residential building. High-end, clean, lit with the particular quality of light that existed in buildings where security was a function of architecture rather than visible personnel. "Out," Caruso said, not to her, but Roman was already moving and the driver was out and she followed because there was nothing else to do, because she was in a parking garage in Manhattan with men she barely knew, and the alternative to following was standing alone in the middle of a concrete level underground, and that option had nothing to recommend it. On elevator, a long ride up. 42 floors, she noted, which put them somewhere in the upper third of what had to be a significant building. The elevator opened directly into an apartment. Not a hallway, the elevator itself opened into the space. And the space was, despite everything, briefly stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides. The city spread below in every direction, rain-blurred and glittering, the East River visible to the right, and the Hudson to the left, and the whole dark glittering island between them laid out like a circuit board running too hot. The apartment was spare in the way that only very expensive spaces could afford to be spare. No clutter, no excess, the kind of restraint that cost more than abundance. She stood in the elevator threshold and didn't move. "Come in," Roman said from somewhere behind her. She came in. The elevator closed behind her. There were two other men already in the apartment. She clocked them as security from the way they positioned themselves, one near the windows and one near the only internal door, standing in the specific casual, not casual posture of people whose job required them to be present without appearing to be present. They looked at her and then looked away, which told her they'd been briefed on her arrival. Roman was at the kitchen counter. She hadn't registered there was a kitchen counter. The open-plan space was disorienting in its scale, and he had a cloth pressed to his jaw now, doing properly what he'd been doing with 2 fingers in the car. "Sit," he said, without looking at her. "I'd like to know—" "I know what you'd like." He turned around. The cloth had a dark stain on it. "Sit down, Miss Voss. I'll explain what I can when I know more than I currently know." She sat on the edge of a low couch because the other option was to keep standing, and her legs had begun, very quietly, to communicate their objections to the last hour. He crossed to where she was, didn't sit, stood with the cloth held loosely, and looked down at her with that direct attention that she had not yet found a way to be comfortable with. "You're not hurt," he said. "No." "You got to the fire escape before we found you." "Yes." "How did you know about the mail corridor?" She looked up at him. "I memorized the building's floor plan during my first month." A pause. "Why?" "Because I always do that." He studied her for a moment that went on a beat longer than conversational. "That's not normal." "I know." He sat then, not on the couch beside her, on the chair across from it, which maintained the professional distance she found she both wanted and found, confusingly, slightly disappointing. He set the cloth on the glass table between them and looked at the far windows. "Rizzo's been escalating for 6 weeks," he said, "hitting our distribution points, our storage facilities, low-level harassment, the kind you absorb and respond to incrementally. Tonight was different. Tonight they came into the building." He said it flatly, like he was reading from a report, and the flatness of it communicated more than volume would have. "That's not harassment, that's a statement." "What kind of statement?" "That they're not afraid of what comes next." He looked at her. "Which means they think something has changed, some balance of information or power that makes them confident enough to walk into my building with guns." She was quiet for a moment. "Or someone told them something had changed." He said nothing. He didn't need to. The thought was already in the room. Caruso came through the internal door, phone still in hand, and the security man near it stepped aside without being asked. Caruso looked at Alara and then at Roman. "We need to talk," he said. "Talk," Roman said. Caruso's eyes went to Alara again. It was a pointed look. "She stays," Roman said. Something crossed Caruso's face. Not quite objection, not quite compliance. The specific expression of a man who had opinions he'd learned to compress into non-expression. He sat in the chair beside Roman's, leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, and said, "Security footage from the building shows Rizzo's people arrived in 2 vehicles that parked on the waterfront side at 9:40. 4 men total went in through the loading bay, which means someone left the bay door open for them. Who had bay access tonight?" "Night crew, 4 men. We're pulling them in." "All 4? "One of them called in sick this afternoon, wasn't there tonight." Caruso's voice was careful and precise, the way a voice got when the information it was conveying had already determined its own implications, and the speaker wanted the listener to arrive at them independently. His replacement was a sub the crew chief called in, someone he vouched for. Roman was quiet. "Where's the crew chief now?" he said. "Bringing him in." "And the sub?" Caruso's jaw moved. "Gone." The words sat in the room. Roman stood up. He walked to the windows and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the rain and the city, and she watched the muscles across his shoulders do something complicated that was visible even through the jacket. Caruso watched him too, with the look of a man who delivered bad news to this specific person enough times to know when to let the silence run. "The money," Roman said, to the window. "Yeah," Caruso said. "I think so too." Alara looked between them. "You think the 2 things are connected, the financial theft and the attack tonight?" Neither of them answered. The silence itself was the answer. "Someone stole from your accounts and fed intelligence to Rizzo," she said, working it out loud because that was how she worked, the verbal articulation of logical sequence. The financial theft wasn't just about money, It was also about access. Whoever was inside your financial system far enough to route $500,000 was inside far enough to know your building's operations, your security protocols, your crew schedules. That's a theory, Caruso said. The loading bay door was left open tonight by someone who was inside your operation, she said. The money was moved through your accounting system by someone who understood it from the inside. The timeline overlaps. Those aren't separate problems. She's right, Roman said, without turning from the window. Said it like it was simply true, and pointing it out required no commentary. Caruso looked at her with an expression that had shifted. Not warmth, not trust. Something more guarded than either. Like a man recalibrating how to categorize someone who'd just demonstrated more utility than he'd allocated for them. The question, Roman said, still to the window, is where the inside access came from. It came from someone you trust, Alara said. He turned around. She didn't look away, though every social instinct she possessed suggested she should. The accounting system requires elevated credentials. The shipping operations require management-level access. The ability to compromise both at the same time, to run the financial scheme and feed operational intelligence simultaneously. That's not one person at a mid-level. That's someone with broad access. She paused. Senior access. The room was completely quiet. The security man near the windows was looking at the floor. Caruso had gone very still. Roman looked at Alara for a long moment. Then he looked at Caruso. And the look that passed between them was the kind of look that lived in the specific territory between old trust and new doubt. And watching it cross Roman DeLuca's face was the first time she understood, concretely and completely, what it actually cost him to hear what she was telling him. Get out, Roman said to Caruso. Caruso stood. Roman, I need to think. Get out. Caruso left. The security men left with him, which she hadn't expected. A silent nod from Roman, and they filed out through the internal door, and she was alone with him in the large spare apartment with the city spread beneath them in every direction. He stood at the windows for a long time without speaking. She sat on the edge of the couch and didn't try to fill the silence, because she had learned early that silence was its own form of information, and interrupting it was always a mistake. How many people, he said finally, still facing the glass, in your assessment, would need to be involved for this to work? One person, she said. With the right access and the right knowledge, one person could have constructed the financial scheme alone. The operational side, the loading bay, the crew schedule, could come from the same person if they had management-level access to operations. One person. With senior access to both systems. Yes, I was quiet again. Then, the people I trust with that level of access. He stopped, started differently. I've known most of them for years. Some of them worked for my father. She said nothing. That doesn't make me right about them, he said. Flat, self-correcting. I know that. I know that. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it, which surprised her slightly. He turned from the window. His expression was controlled again. The brief, unguarded moment closed off. But she had seen it, and it stayed with her in the particular way that things stayed with her when she'd filed them in the part of her that didn't delete. You'll stay here tonight, he said. There are rooms. You're not safe at your apartment. If Rizzo's people had your name, they have your address. She thought about her apartment, her books, her 3 good pans, and her one real indulgence, the expensive coffee maker she'd bought herself the year she'd paid off her student loans, the ordinary geography of a life built for one. Tomorrow, she said, tomorrow we figure out the next step. And the day after. He looked at her steadily. I don't know yet. It was, she thought, probably the most honest thing he'd said to her, which was a strange thing to find reassuring, given everything. She slept badly. The room she was given was large and quiet, and too still after the building's sounds she'd spent 14 months memorizing. Different creaks, different silences, different traffic from 42 floors up instead of 3. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and ran the numbers, the way she always ran numbers when she couldn't sleep. That particular mental settling into pattern and sequence that worked better than anything else she'd found to quiet the noise in her head. The financial scheme. 16 transactions. 4 months. The specific language used in the falsified shipping descriptions that she'd noted during her initial walkthrough with Roman. Language that indicated familiarity. Not just with the accounting system, but with the operational culture of how Belladonna described its cargo. She thought about who she'd seen in that building over 14 months. The people who moved through its floors with the casual authority of ownership. The people whose names appeared on internal communications with the frequency and weight of individuals who occupied structural positions in the organization. She thought about Dominic Sartori. She'd never spoken with him directly. He was Roman's operational second. She'd heard this described in approximately those terms in conversations she'd been careful to appear not to be listening to. Mid-30s, compact, with the particular groomed precision of a man who cared about how he appeared and had the resources to care effectively. She'd seen him in the building often. She'd seen him in the loading bay once, moving through the cargo operations, with the ease of someone who knew every protocol. She'd seen him, she realized now, in the financial wing twice. Not in the accounting department itself, in the corridor outside it, which had no particular reason to bring someone of his function to that floor. Once standing at the copier near the records room, which she'd noted and filed without knowing why it had registered. Once talking to Gerald Price outside the conference room, a conversation she hadn't been close enough to hear. She lay in the dark and felt the cold, specific weight of a conclusion assembling itself from component parts that had always been in the room, just not arranged correctly. At 7 in the morning, she got up, dressed in yesterday's clothes, and found Roman already in the main room. He was on his phone, standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee he hadn't drunk, reading something on the screen. The cut on his jaw had been cleaned and closed with what looked like a small butterfly strip. He was in the same clothes he'd been in last night, which told her he hadn't slept either. He looked up when she came in. Something in his expression shifted. Not a lot, a small recalibration, the particular look of someone who had expected to be alone a moment longer and was adjusting to not being. "Coffee," he said, gesturing at the machine. She made a cup. She stood at the counter 12 feet from him and drank it and said, "Dominic Sartori." He went still. "I've seen him in the financial corridor twice in 14 months, she said. "No operational reason for him to be there. I've seen him in the loading bay moving through cargo operations with management-level familiarity. He has senior access to both systems." She paused. "I can't prove it yet, but I think it's him." Roman set his phone down very carefully on the counter. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. The components were there, she could see them, but the combination produced something new, something that didn't map cleanly onto any category she'd previously assigned to him. "Dominic," he said. Just the name. Flat and heavy, the way something fell when you dropped it from a significant height. "I need to go back into the system," she said. "I need to trace the shell corporations that received the transferred funds. That takes time and access, and I need to be at my workstation or somewhere with equivalent—" "No. Roman, the building is a crime scene right now." He stopped. "Not officially. But my people are going through it, and Rizzo's people were in it last night, and you are not going back there. Then I need remote access, or a clean workstation in your accounting system credentials." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're already thinking about the next part." "I never stop thinking about the next part," she said. "That's how this works. You don't get answers by stopping." I was quiet. Then he moved past her to the interior door and knocked twice. The door opened. Caruso, on the other side, which meant Caruso had been in the adjacent room all night, a detail she added to her mental file on the organizational dynamics of Roman DeLuca's operation. "Get her a workstation," Roman said. "Clean machine, full accounting system access, remote connection to the Belladonna servers." Caruso looked at Ilara, then at Roman. "You trust her with full access?" "I'm standing here," Ilara said. "I'm aware," Caruso said, and his voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there the night before, a specific sharpness that landed somewhere between distrust and warning. "Caruso," Roman said. "Yeah." Caruso looked away from her. "I'll get it." He left. Roman turned back to Ilara, and she was standing there with her coffee cooling in both hands and her eyes on the middle distance, running the next logical sequence, the architecture of the investigation she was about to open up. The questions the data would answer and the ones it wouldn't, and the specific gap between what she suspected and what she'd be able to prove. "Ilara," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noted it the way she noted everything. Involuntarily, precisely, filed in the part of her that didn't delete. "What I told you last night, that you're safe, I meant that." "I believe you," she said, and was surprised to find that she did, "but I need you to understand something." He stepped closer, not much, just enough that the distance between them reduced from a professional 12 feet to something that didn't have a clean professional category. If you're right about Dominic, this gets very complicated very fast. Dominic has been in my organization since before my father died. He has relationships with every senior person I have. He has information about every operation we run. I understand. If you're wrong, those same relationships become problems in a different direction. I'm not wrong. He held her gaze for a beat. How sure are you? 90%, she said. Give me access to the Shell Corporation registrations, and I'll get you to 100. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, not quite, but something in the same neighborhood, something that happened and then retracted almost before she'd verified it. He turned away. Then let's get you to 100, he said. She spent the next 6 hours at the workstation Caruso set up in the apartment's second bedroom, and the work was the cleanest she'd felt in days. The specific relief of a problem that could be approached systematically, a trail that had to lead somewhere because money always led somewhere, because every financial crime was ultimately just a story told in numbers, and every story had a narrator who left traces of themselves in the telling. The Shell corporations were the key. There were 4 of them, she established within the first 2 hours. 3 registered in Delaware, 1 in Nevada, all created within a 6-month window 18 months ago. The Delaware corporations used a registered agent service that offered privacy protection, but the Nevada filing had been done directly, and the initial organizer documents named a law firm that she cross-referenced against Belladonna Trading's own legal vendor list. It was the same firm. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screen and felt the cold satisfaction of a column that balanced. The satisfaction that never got ordinary no matter how many times she'd felt it. The law firm that had incorporated the Nevada Shell Company, that had received $63,000 of Belladonna Trading's money, was the same law firm listed in Belladonna's operational records as handling their commercial real estate contracts. She printed the documentation. She cross-referenced the Shell Company's registered agent against Belladonna's vendor records a second time to be certain. She confirmed the timeline, incorporation dates, transaction dates, the specific sequence that established which came first. Then she went to find Roman. I was in the main room, on the phone again, and when she came in, he looked at her face and ended the call without finishing his sentence, which told her something about what her expression was communicating. She laid the printout on the table between them. The Nevada Shell, she said. Your law firm incorporated it. He looked at the documents. He was very still. That's not automatically Dominic, she said. Someone used your firm, which means someone with access to your legal relationships. But combined with the access patterns, the timeline, the cargo familiarity, she stopped. There's one more thing I need to check. Your communication records for the months the transactions ran. I need to look for anything that shows Belladonna's shipping schedules being externally transmitted. Communication records, he said, flat. Internal emails, operational messaging. If Dominic was feeding Rizzo's people your shipping data, he was transmitting it somehow. The financial records gave me the money trail. I need the communication records for the intelligence trail. Roman looked at the printout for a long time. Then he looked up. Those records, he said carefully, contain information about operations that I don't make available to people outside my immediate circle. I know. You'd see things in there that you can't unsee. She met his eyes. I'm already here, she said. I'm already in this. Whatever I see in those records, I'm already in far enough that it doesn't change my position. He studied her. The look went on long enough to become something more than appraisal. It was the look of a man considering something carefully, not just the operational question, but the larger one underneath it, the one about the person sitting across from him, and what it meant that she was the one who had found this and who was still, despite everything, pulling the thread. He made a decision. She could see it happen, the moment when consideration ended and commitment began. I'll get you the records, he said. She nodded and turned back toward the workstation, and she was almost to the door when Caruso came through it from the other direction, fast, with his phone in his hand and something in his face that rearranged the room's temperature. We have a problem, he said to Roman, and his voice was the voice of a man carrying news that had no good version. What? Roman said. The crew chief we brought in. Caruso's eyes moved to Alara and then back to Roman. He's not talking, but before we picked him up, he made 2 calls. He held out his phone. One of them was to a number we traced to a Rizzo associate. Roman said nothing. The second one, Caruso said, was to Dominic. The room went completely still. Alara stood in the doorway between the hall and the main room, with the printout still in her hands, and felt the thing that had been assembling itself over the last 12 hours snap into its final configuration. Clean, complete, and terrible, in the way that true things were sometimes terrible. Not because they were surprising, but because they weren't. She watched Roman's face in the second after Caruso said the name. She watched the controlled stillness that he always wore absorb the information, the way a wall absorbed an impact, holding just barely, and the fracture lines under the surface invisible unless you were looking for them. She was always looking, and what she saw in Roman DeLuca's face in that moment wasn't rage. It wasn't shock. It was something older and quieter and more destructive than either. It was the particular grief of a man who had just confirmed something he had already, on some level, already known, and had been hoping until this exact second that he was wrong about. The word hung in the air between all three of them, unfinished, and nobody moved. Then Roman said, "Get the car." Caruso moved. The security men materialized from wherever they'd been positioned, and the apartment's quiet machinery of readiness shifted into something with more weight to it, more velocity, the specific organized urgency of people who'd done this before and knew exactly what each stage required. Alara stood in the doorway and held the printout and watched Roman cross to the window one more time. The window he kept returning to, she'd noticed, the way people returned to a fixed point when the ground was moving under them, and stand there for exactly 4 seconds. She counted. 4 seconds, looking out at the city in the gray morning light. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator without looking at her. "Come," he said. Not a request. She came. The car ride was different from the night before. Last night had been controlled urgency. A man managing an active crisis with the tools he had available. This morning had a different quality. Roman sat beside her in the back seat and said nothing for 11 minutes, and the silence had a density to it, a specific atmospheric pressure. And Alara sat with the printout in her lap and did not try to speak into it because she understood, on the instinctive level she trusted most, that speaking into this particular silence would be a mistake. Caruso was on the phone in the front. Short sentences. Names she didn't recognize. Confirmations. She watched Roman's hands. They were still, resting on his thighs, not clenched, not moving. The stillness of a man applying significant internal force to produce the appearance of calm. She'd seen that kind of stillness before, in different contexts, different people, but it always meant the same thing. Whatever was happening on the surface was the managed version of something much larger happening underneath. The car pulled into a building she didn't recognize. Industrial, outer borough, the kind of structure that didn't advertise its purpose. A loading dock, a roll-up door, fluorescent light inside. They got out. 2 men she hadn't seen before were waiting, and they exchanged looks with Caruso that communicated entire paragraphs. Roman walked inside without stopping. She followed. The interior was a large open space, warehouse floor, concrete, clean in the specific way that spaces got cleaned when their owners were serious about their maintenance. Metal shelving along 2 walls. A table in the center, industrial, with chairs that had been placed around it recently enough that one of them still had its legs uneven on the floor. Sitting at the table was a man she recognized, Marco Testa, the Belladonna crew chief. She'd seen him on the loading dock dozens of times across 14 months. Stocky, 60-something, gray at the temples. The kind of man who moved cargo with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since before she was born. He'd always nodded at her when she passed the bay. The brief acknowledgement of 2 people who occupied the same building without belonging to the same world. He did not look like himself now. He looked like a man who had spent the night understanding exactly how much trouble he was in and had not arrived at any conclusions that made him feel better about it. He looked up when they came in. His eyes went to Roman and stayed there. Roman sat across from him. He didn't set anything on the table. He didn't produce documents or make gestures of any kind. He just sat and looked at the man, and the quality of that look was something Alara felt from 10 feet away. Not rage, not threat exactly, something more total than either. The look of a man who had already passed through the stage of wanting answers and arrived at the stage of requiring them. "Marco," he said, just the name. Testa's jaw worked. He was looking at the table now. "Roman, I want you to know." "Don't," Roman said. "Don't tell me what you want me to know. Tell me what happened." A long pause. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in this building structure, a pipe knocked twice and went silent. Dominic came to me 8 months ago, Testa said. His voice was the voice of a man who had made his decision about what to say and was now committed to delivering it with whatever dignity he had left. He said there were changes coming in the organization, restructuring. He said the business was going more legitimate and that the dock operations would be scaled back. He said the men who positioned themselves right, who helped the transition happen smoothly, would be taken care of. Taken care of, Roman said. That's what he said. And what did helping the transition smoothly involve? Testa's eyes came up briefly and then went back down. Leaving doors open when he told me to, adjusting crew schedules, keeping certain containers off the manifest log until they'd been checked. By who? I didn't know who. I didn't ask. He said it quickly, with the delivery of a man who'd been repeating this particular statement to himself all night as a kind of protection. He told me not to ask, and I didn't ask. You left the bay door open last night. He called me at 3 in the afternoon, said there was a scheduled delivery, special handling, use the sub and take the night off. And you didn't find that unusual. Testa's mouth opened and closed. He had the expression of a man watching himself from outside, seeing clearly the choices he'd made and how they'd assembled themselves into this room, this table, this moment, and finding no version of the story where he came out of it looking like someone who hadn't known what he was involved in. I needed it to not be unusual, he said. Quiet. The quiet of a man being honest for the first time in a conversation. I've got a daughter in school. I've got bills. Dominic told me I'd be taken care of, and He stopped. I needed to believe that. Roman stood up. I didn't say anything else to Testa. He looked at Caruso, who was standing by the door, and something passed between them in the nonverbal language of people who'd worked together long enough to not need words for certain things. Then Roman walked to the far end of the warehouse, away from the table, and stood facing the shelving with his back to the room. Elara watched him stand there. She watched the controlled stillness that was his default mode work harder than she'd seen it work before. The visible effort of a man managing something that wanted very badly to become something else. She crossed the warehouse floor. She didn't know why exactly. Some combination of the forensic instinct that pulled her toward the center of a problem, and the other thing, the thing she was still in the process of naming, that pulled her toward him specifically. She stopped beside him, not close, just near. He built this over 8 months, she said quietly enough that her voice didn't carry to the table. Testa, the bay access, the sub-placement. The financial scheme took 4 months before that. He was planning this for over a year. Roman said nothing. That's not opportunism, she said. That's construction. He built something very specific, and he built it carefully, and he built it while standing next to you every day. I know what it is, Roman said. I know you do. She paused. I'm saying it out loud because I think it needs to be said out loud. What he did required patience and proximity and the specific kind of trust that you'd given him, and he used all of it. Another pause. That's not a reflection of your judgment. That's a reflection of his. Roman turned his head and looked at her, and she saw again what she'd seen in the apartment. That brief, unguarded quality, the thing underneath the control that he kept very carefully managed, and that appeared only in the specific moments when the management cost too much. You don't know that, he said. I know that the best liars are indistinguishable from honest people, she said. That's not a philosophical position. That's what forensic accounting teaches you. People steal from organizations they've served loyally for years. The loyalty was real. The stealing was also real. Both things exist at the same time. He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked back at the shelving. I need the communication records, he said. The ones you asked for. I need to know how much intelligence he passed to Rizzo and over what time frame. I need a workstation. You'll have one. He paused. And I need to know if anyone else was involved. If Dominic had a network inside my organization, or if he was operating alone. The financial trail will show payment flows if there were other people involved. Indirect payments, cash conversions, anything routed through the same shell structure. She thought for a moment. It'll take time. The shell corporations are layered. He was careful. But careful people still make mistakes when they've been running something for a long time. They get comfortable. They start cutting small corners. He got comfortable, Roman said. I gave him reason to. You gave him trust, she said. That's not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Go back to the car. I'll be there in 5 minutes. She went back to the car. She sat in the back seat and looked at the printout in her hands and thought about Dominic Sartori. His face in the few times she'd seen him in the building's corridors, the groomed precision she'd noted without knowing why she was noting it, the way he'd moved through Belladonna's spaces with the ease of complete belonging. A man who'd spent a year building his exit while standing inside the thing he was dismantling. She thought about what that required. Not just the technical skill, the financial architecture, the operational coordination, but the psychological capacity, the ability to sit across from Roman DeLuca every day and maintain the face of loyalty while actively working to destroy him, to have conversations about protecting the organization while routing its money to shell companies, to attend meetings about responding to Rizzo's provocations while personally enabling them. That was a specific kind of person. It made her think about herself, about the 14 months she'd spent being invisible, the careful professional performance she'd maintained, the conscious effort to give nobody a reason to look at her. She'd told herself that was self-protection, reasonable caution in a complicated environment. She'd told herself there was no deception in it. The difference, she supposed, was what you were hiding and why. Roman came back to the car in exactly 5 minutes. He got in and looked straight ahead and said, "There's something else." She waited. Caruso ran Testa's phone records while we were in there. He turned to look at her. The second call. The one to Dominic. It was after Caruso contacted Testa to bring him in, which means Dominic knows we have him. The implication was immediate and cold. Dominic knows his name came up. Yes, which means he knows the direction the investigation is moving. Yes. She looked at him steadily. How much does Dominic know about what I've found? Roman's expression tightened by a fraction. I haven't told him. But Caruso... He stopped. Caruso told him, she said. I don't know that. Did you tell Caruso not to? The silence answered the question. She looked out the window. The building's roll-up door was closing behind them as they pulled out, the gray exterior sealing itself shut. And she thought about trust and information and the way organizations leaked the way all human systems leaked, through the gaps between people, through the spaces where loyalty was assumed rather than confirmed. If Dominic knows the investigation is pointing at him, she said, he has two options. He runs, or he acts first. He won't run, Roman said. Running confirms guilt. Dominic is too smart to run. A pause. He'll act first. What does acting first look like for him? It looks like controlling the narrative. He'll come to me. He'll get in front of it. Roman's jaw was tight. He's done it before. When something went wrong in the organization, Dominic was always the first person in my office, always with the most detailed account of what had happened and who was responsible. I used to think that was loyalty. You used to think, she said carefully. Now I think he was managing me. He said it without inflection, which was worse, somehow, than bitterness would have been. Putting his version of events in my head first, so that when other versions arrived, mine was already built around his. Alara thought about that. She thought about the architecture of it, a year of patient construction, of managing Roman's information environment, of being the most trusted voice in the room. Not just stealing money, controlling perception. Those were two different orders of capability. He's going to come to you today, she said, with a version of last night that explains everything in a way that makes him safe. Yes. And you can't let him know, you know. Roman looked at her. If he comes to you and you confront him before we have complete documentation, she said, he'll lawyer up, he'll move money, he'll eliminate whatever physical evidence exists of the communication with Rizzo, and you'll have my spreadsheet and Testa's testimony and a Nevada shell corporation that a good attorney could spend 6 months complicating. She held his gaze. I need 48 hours with the communication records. Let him come to you. Hear his version. Give him nothing back. You want me to sit across from him and give him nothing? Yes. Knowing what I know. Yes. He stared at her for a moment that had edges on it. You understand what you're asking. I understand exactly what I'm asking, she said. I'm asking you to do the hardest thing there is, which is to act as if you don't know something you know. You're capable of it. You've been doing it for years. She paused. Just do it for 48 more hours. The car moved through streets that were getting busier as the morning filled in, the city's volume rising around them, and Roman DeLuca sat in the back seat of his car and looked at a forensic accountant in yesterday's clothes, holding a printed document, and said nothing for a long time. Then, 48 hours. That's all I need. He looked back at the road. You'd better be right about what you can find. I'm always right about what I can find, she said. I just sometimes don't like what it is. They went back to the apartment. Caruso was already there. He'd come back separately, and the workstation had been expanded. A second monitor added, a direct connection to the communication archives that Alara had requested. She sat down and began. The communication records were extensive. 3 years of internal messaging across the organization's encrypted system. The kind of system that felt secure from the outside but was, like all such systems, only as secure as the people who administered it. She wasn't trying to crack the encryption. She was looking at metadata, patterns of contact, timing of messages, the specific architecture of who talked to whom, when, with what frequency, and how those patterns shifted across the timeline she'd established for the financial scheme. It took 4 hours to find the first thread. Dominic's communication pattern with an external number. Not Rizzo directly. She expected he was too careful for that. Showed a specific anomaly. Every time a large belladonna shipment was scheduled, a message went to the external number within a 12-hour window. Not every shipment, specific ones, the ones that involved the cargo lines she'd already flagged in the financial records. She pulled the shipping logs, cross-referenced the dates, matched them against the financial transactions. 11 of the 16 financial transactions had a corresponding outbound communication from Dominic's device to the external number within 12 hours of the relevant cargo movement. She sat back and looked at the screen. This was not a person who had made opportunistic choices. This was a person who had been running a parallel operation, feeding Rizzo's people real-time intelligence about shipments, taking payment through the Shell Corporation structure, and covering the financial movement by routing it through Belladonna's own accounts, so that if it were ever found, it would look like an internal embezzlement rather than external collaboration. 2 crimes designed to obscure each other. She was still working through the final documentation when the apartment's elevator opened. She heard it from the back bedroom, the soft mechanical sound of arrival. And then voices in the main room, Caruso's voice. And then a voice she'd heard once in a building corridor, and twice more in passing, a voice she'd filed and not thought she'd need again. Dominic Sartori's voice. She went still at the workstation. She heard Roman's voice, brief, greeting, the 2 men settling into the main room. She couldn't make out words from this distance. She looked at her screen. The documentation was 80% complete, the remaining 20% sitting in the communication archives requiring another 2 hours of cross-referencing. She had not had 48 hours. She had had 4. She pressed her back against the chair and listened to the muffled conversation from the main room and thought very fast. She could stay in the back bedroom, let Roman handle it, give him nothing back, the way she'd told him to, let Dominic deliver his version and leave. She had enough documentation to be dangerous, even if it wasn't complete. 80% was far more than nothing. Then she heard Roman say her name, not calling for her, saying it to Dominic, in the context of a sentence she couldn't fully hear. And she heard, in the brief silence that followed, the particular quality of attention that a room acquired when a subject was being discussed by 2 people who had different relationships to it. She stood up. She picked up the printed documentation. Everything she'd printed in the last 4 hours, 12 pages, not complete but substantial. And she walked to the door of the back bedroom and opened it and came into the main room. Dominic Sartori was sitting in the chair across from Roman. He was dressed with his usual groomed precision, dark jacket, open collar, the composed presentation of a man who had chosen his appearance for a specific meeting. He looked up when she appeared, and something moved through his expression so fast she almost missed it. Almost. She'd spent 14 months making herself invisible to men like him. Men who looked through people like her, past them, at the space they occupied without registering the contents. She recognized the instinct in his expression, the automatic dismissal, the quick recategorization, the way his attention started to slide back toward Roman. She was done being invisible. "Miss Voss," Dominic said. His voice was warm and professionally courteous in the specific way of a man whose courtesy was a tool. "I heard you were with Roman last night. Terrible business. I'm glad you weren't hurt." She set the 12 pages of documentation on the table between them. She didn't say anything. She just set them down and stood there and let him look at them. He looked at them for a long moment. The warmth in his expression didn't immediately disappear. Good liars didn't allow immediate disappearances. But something underneath it changed, the structural load-bearing quality of the performance shifting in a way that was, to someone who was watching for it, completely visible. "What is this?" he said. 11 of 16 financial transactions in the scheme I've been investigating," she said. matched against outbound communications from your device to an external number within 12-hour windows. The external number traces to a Rizzo associate through a relay I identified this morning. She kept her voice level, the forensic voice, the voice she used when the numbers were what mattered and emotion was just noise. The shell corporation that received the funds used your law firm for incorporation. The Bay access that enabled last night's attack came from a crew chief you'd been managing for 8 months. The room was absolutely still. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Roman. And what she saw in that look, in the specific calculation of it, the rapid processing that happened behind his eyes as he assessed the room, assessed what she'd laid down, assessed what Roman's expression was telling him about how much ground he'd already lost, was the face of a man abandoning a version of events he'd spent weeks constructing. Roman, he said. His voice had changed. Still controlled, but different. The warmth gone, something harder, replacing it. You're going to take the word of an accountant you've known for 2 weeks over 15 years. 14 months, Ilara said. Dominic's eyes cut to her. What? I've worked for Belladonna Trading for 14 months, she said. You walked past my office regularly during that time. You walked past me. She held his gaze. You should have paid more attention. Something happened in Dominic's face that she hadn't expected. Not anger, something colder than anger, something that recognized a specific kind of defeat and was deciding, in real time, how to manage it. His eyes moved back to Roman. Whatever she found, it can be explained, he said. Explain it, Roman said. First time he'd spoken since she'd come into the room. Not here. Not like this. Dominic's voice had the precise calibration of a man trying to reframe the conversation's terms. You sit down with lawyers, you look at context. You don't make decisions based on Dominic. Roman's voice was quiet and final, the voice of a door closing. Explain it here. The silence stretched. Ilara watched Dominic process the room. Roman's stillness, the documentation on the table, her standing there, the position of the 2 security men she was now aware had materialized near the apartment's exits. She watched him calculate and come up empty. You have no idea, Dominic said softly, what I've protected you from. Tell me, Roman said. Things your father asked me to manage before he died. Things that were never in any record anywhere because they were never supposed to be. I kept this organization intact through the transition, Roman. I kept people in line who would have moved against you the week your father's body was cold. I did things. He stopped. His voice had changed again, something raw under the surface of it now, something that was either genuine or a very good performance of genuine. I kept the wolves away from the door for 18 months, and nobody gave me more than a title and a percentage. So you took more, Roman said. The word landed. Dominic's jaw tightened. I took what I was owed. From me. From the organization. I am the organization. Roman said it without raising his voice, and the absence of volume made it worse somehow, made it heavier. When you stole from it, you stole from me. When you fed Rizzo my shipping data, you put my people at risk. Last night, men came into my building. They knew her name. He looked at Ilara briefly and then back at Dominic. They knew her name because you gave it to them. The specific silence that followed that statement was different from the silences that had come before. This one had recognition in it. Ilara felt something cold move through her chest. She'd been so focused on the financial trail, on the structural architecture of the scheme, that she hadn't explicitly assembled this particular piece. Dominic had given Rizzo her name. Dominic had told Rizzo's people that an accountant at Belladonna had found something. Dominic had made her a target. She looked at him across the table. He looked back. And in his eyes, for just a moment, she saw the thing underneath the calculation and the management and the performed warmth. A cold, functional assessment, the look of a man for whom she had been. From the first moment her investigation threatened him, simply a problem to be solved. She was going to expose everything, he said. Not to Roman. To the room. Almost conversationally. A forensic accountant runs a routine audit and finds something she wasn't supposed to find. And suddenly the whole thing unravels. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to come to me, Roman said. And say what? That I'd been stealing from you for a year? Dominic's voice had a bitter edge now, the bitterness of a man who had run out of moves and knew it. Come to you and hand myself the consequences. Yes. You would have. Yes, Roman said. And then nothing else. The word was its own complete sentence. Dominic looked at Roman for a long moment with an expression that she struggled to name. Grief was part of it, she thought, genuine grief. Whatever remained of the actual relationship once you stripped away the betrayal. 15 years. She had no framework for what 15 years of proximity, of shared stakes, of the particular loyalty that operated in criminal organizations felt like to lose. She didn't think Dominic had a framework for it either. She thought he'd understood, on some level, what losing it would cost him, and had proceeded anyway. And she thought that was perhaps the most specific kind of tragedy, not the kind that surprised you, but the kind that you could see coming from a long way away and couldn't stop, because the same capacity that let you see it clearly also let you tell yourself it wouldn't arrive. Roman stood up. Dominic stood up. And then Dominic's hand moved. It was fast, faster than she would have expected from a man in a suit, in a living room, having what had appeared to be a conversation. And she didn't fully process what she was seeing until Caruso moved faster, coming from her left. And there was a sound of impact, and the small object that had appeared in Dominic's hand was no longer in his hand, and was on the floor somewhere, and Dominic was against the wall with Caruso's forearm across his chest. Ilara had not moved. She was still standing exactly where she'd been standing, with the 12 pages of documentation on the table in front of her, and her heart was doing something that had nothing to do with the accounting mind and everything to do with the animal body that contained it. Roman was looking at her. "Are you—" he started. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out steady. It was a lie, or it was true. She genuinely couldn't tell which. He looked at her for a moment, and what she saw in his face was the thing she'd seen in the warehouse parking garage, in the car, in the apartment at 7 in the morning. The specific quality of a man whose default mode was not to show what things cost him, showing her what this cost him. Then he looked at Dominic, pinned against the wall, and his expression closed. "Get him out," he said to Caruso. Caruso got him out. The door closed. Roman stood in the center of the room for a moment that felt suspended, the aftermath of everything settling into the apartment's expensive silence. Ilara stood on the other side of the table. The 12 pages were still there between them. He looked at the documentation. He looked at her. "This is enough?" he said. "With Testa's testimony, yes," she said. "It's enough." "For what comes next?" She understood what he was asking, not a legal question. Something else. The kind of resolution that didn't go through courts. The kind he'd described in her office the morning after she'd told him what she'd found. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, and she stood in the middle of Roman DeLuca's Manhattan apartment, 42 floors above a city that had never known she existed, and understood that the woman who had walked into Belladonna Trading's third-floor accounting wing 14 months ago, the woman who wore furniture-colored coats and angled her monitor to block eye contact and ate lunch alone with the volume all the way down, was not the same woman anymore. She knew it the way you knew certain things, not with drama, not with announcement, but with the quiet certainty of a column that had finally balanced after months of carrying an error you couldn't locate. Something had shifted in the last 72 hours with the irreversibility of a bone that had broken and set in a new position. You could feel the difference in how the weight distributed. She picked up the 12 pages from the table and set them in a neat stack and said, "I need to finish the documentation, the last 20%. Roman looked at her. "Now." "Now," she said. "Before anything else moves." He nodded once. She went back to the workstation. She finished in 90 minutes. The final cross-references locked the communication pattern into a complete timeline. 16 months of Dominic Sartori running a parallel operation inside Roman DeLuca's organization, feeding Rizzo's people intelligence, siphoning funds through a shell structure sophisticated enough to survive casual review and not sophisticated enough to survive her. She printed the complete documentation, 23 pages. She stacked them in order, clipped them, and carried them to Roman. He read every page. She sat across from him while he did it and watched the controlled stillness of his face absorb information that she knew, from having assembled it herself, constituted something close to a complete structural betrayal of everything he'd inherited and built. He read without expression, turning pages with the methodical focus of a man who had decided that the only way through a thing was through it, that looking away was not an available option. When he finished, he set the stack down. "Rizzo paid him through the shell structure," he said. "Yes. Reverse engineered from the Nevada registration. The payment started 14 months ago." She paused. 2 months before I was hired. Roman looked up. I don't think that's a coincidence, she said. Dominic would have been managing personnel at that point, a forensic accountant coming into the accounting wing while he was running a financial scheme through the accounting system. He would have flagged that. He approved your hire, Roman said. Flat. I know. He cleared you through the agency vetting. Yes. She held his gaze, which means he looked at my background, made a determination that I wasn't a threat, and let me through. He underestimated me. She said it without satisfaction, because it wasn't satisfying exactly. It was just true, the way a lot of things were true that you wished were different. People usually do. Roman was quiet for a moment, then, what does Rizzo know about where we are right now? He knows the attack last night didn't neutralize the investigation. He knows Testa was pulled in. If Dominic communicated with him before we got here this morning, she thought about the timeline. He had a window between Caruso's call to Testa and our arrival at the warehouse, maybe 40 minutes. 40 minutes is enough. Yes, Roman stood. He moved to the window again, the fixed point, and stood with his hands at his sides and looked out at the city in the thin afternoon light. And she watched him think with the specific quality of attention she'd developed for him over the last 3 days. The reading of a man who communicated more through stillness than most people communicated through speech. Rizzo's going to move tonight, he said. Not a question. If Dominic told him the documentation exists and that you have it, he'll move tonight, Roman said again, before we can use it, before we can determine what to do with it. She thought about that. What are his options? He can hit the people who matter, me, Caruso, the senior men. He turned from the window. You. The word landed in her chest with the specific weight of the personal, not abstract threat, but the very concrete understanding that she was, in Rizzo's calculation, a component of the problem that needed to be resolved. The woman who'd built the documentation, the woman who could testify to what she'd found and how she'd found it. You need to move tonight first, she said. Yes. What does that look like? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen clearly before, the previous versions of it having been partials, fragments, the corners of something she hadn't had enough angle to identify. What she saw now was the complete version, and it was simpler than she'd expected. It was the face of a man who was about to do something very dangerous, and who had made his peace with that and was now in the operational stage, past the point of weighing options, committed. It looks like ending this, he said. They moved at 6 in the evening. She was not supposed to be in the car. That had been made very clear in the 20 minutes of terse, rapid planning that happened in the apartment before departure. Roman and Caruso and 2 senior men she'd been introduced to only by last names, Greco and Falco, laying out a sequence of action with the compressed efficiency of people who had done versions of this before. Her name had not appeared anywhere in that sequence. The plan as articulated placed her in the apartment with 2 security men and a direct line to Roman's phone, and the understanding that she would remain there until contacted. She had agreed to this. She had agreed with the full sincerity of a woman who had already, in the back of her mind, calculated the alternative. The alternative was this. Dominic Sartori, wherever he had been taken, had been in Roman's organization for 15 years. He knew the people who would be moving tonight. He knew the protocols, the communication patterns, the organizational structure of everything Roman was deploying. And if he had communicated with Rizzo in that 40-minute window this morning, if he had told Rizzo not just that the documentation existed, but that the accountant who built it was being kept at Roman's apartment address, which Dominic would have known because Dominic knew everything, then the 2 security men Roman had left with her were not enough. She'd thought about raising this. She'd decided not to, because raising it would have produced either an argument she'd lose or a delay that cost time they didn't have. Instead, she'd waited until the apartment was clear, told the security men she needed air and would stand on the terrace, and then used the service elevator that she'd identified during her first hour in the building, because she always identified service elevators. She was in a cab 3 blocks away before anyone thought to check the terrace. She called Roman from the cab. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear ambient sound behind him, movement, low voices, the particular organized noise of people preparing. Elara. His voice was tight. I know, she said. Don't. Listen to me. Dominic had 40 minutes this morning, and he knows this address, and 2 men isn't enough if Rizzo decides to move on the apartment before you finish tonight. So you left the apartment. I'm in a cab. I'm coming to you. That's the opposite of safer. I know where you're going, she said. I cross-referenced your organizational records against Rizzo's known operational addresses during the last 2 hours of my documentation work. The meeting point you're using tonight is the storage facility on Coffee Street. I'll be there in 12 minutes. Silence. Roman. If you get hurt, I've been running from armed men through dark buildings for 3 days, she said. I can manage 12 minutes in a cab. Another silence, longer this time. Side entrance, he said. Caruso will be there. She was there in 11 minutes. Caruso met her at the side entrance with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, none of them warm. He looked at her for a moment, then looked past her at the departing cab, then looked back at her. He said to let you in, he said. Then let me in, she said. He let her in. The facility was a working warehouse, active, staffed, the kind of legitimate commercial operation that functioned as cover and infrastructure simultaneously. The ground floor was standard storage, palletized goods, the industrial smell of cardboard and climate control. Caruso moved her through it fast, up a metal staircase to a mezzanine level that overlooked the floor below, where she could see Roman with Greco and Falco and 4 other men she didn't recognize gathered around a table spread with what appeared to be a diagram. Roman looked up when she appeared on the mezzanine. He looked at her for a moment that had edges on it, the look of a man managing the conflict between operational control and something else, something that didn't have a clean professional name. Then he went back to the table. She stayed on the mezzanine. She could see the diagram from here, a building layout, a street address she recognized from her research. Rizzo's primary operational headquarters, a converted commercial building in Carroll Gardens that appeared in 3 separate records she'd cross-referenced. They were going to Rizzo directly. She understood the logic of it. Dominic had compromised the inside of Roman's organization badly enough that containment was impossible. Any attempt to manage the situation through incremental responses would hemorrhage through whatever additional access Dominic had sold. The only clean resolution was the one that removed the external pressure entirely. She stood at the mezzanine railing and watched the planning below, and felt the particular cold clarity of a situation that had moved past the stage where her specific skills were the primary instrument and into a stage that was entirely outside her competence. Numbers she could trace, shell corporations she could dismantle, financial schemes she could reconstruct from their component parts with enough time and access. She had no access to what was about to happen. They moved at 7:15. She was not supposed to go. She stayed in the warehouse, Caruso's orders, 2 men with her on the mezzanine, and she stood at the railing and looked at the empty floor below where the table had been cleared and the diagram folded and taken, and she breathed and waited. The waiting was worse than the running had been. Running was at least active. It engaged the body, gave the fear somewhere to go. Waiting was just the fear with nowhere to go, cycling through the same calculations, the same risk assessments, the same variables she'd been running for 3 days without being able to arrive at a number that felt stable. At 7:41, her phone rang. Caruso. Not Roman. She answered. We have a problem, Caruso said, and his voice had the quality she'd learned to read as genuine crisis rather than managed tension. Rizzo wasn't at Carroll Gardens. The building was empty. He moved in the last 6 hours. She gripped the railing. Where? We don't know yet. He stopped. She heard something in the background. Hold on. She held on. She looked at the empty warehouse floor below and listened to the muffled sounds on the other end of the phone and ran the problem. Rizzo had moved. That meant he'd known they were coming. That meant Dominic had communicated more than she'd calculated. Not just the existence of the documentation, not just her location, but Roman's operational plans for tonight, which meant either Dominic had been told the plans before he'd been removed from the apartment, or, Caruso, she said. 1 second. Caruso. Who knew tonight's target location before the briefing? A pause. What? The Carroll Gardens address. Who knew it before you laid it out on the table tonight? She heard him breathe. Me. Roman. Greco. Greco, she said. A longer pause. Greco's been with us for... I know how long he's been with you, she said. Dominic didn't work alone. I told Roman this morning. The financial trail would show payment flows if there were other people involved. I hadn't finished tracing them when everything accelerated. She kept her voice level with the specific effort of a woman who had learned over the last 3 days that the only useful thing she could do with fear was run it through the analytical mind and make it work. Check Greco's communication records from the last 2 hours. Right now. Silence on the line. Long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. She'd been doing that, she realized, counting heartbeats the way she counted everything, because numbers were reliable when nothing else was. Christ, Caruso said. Where is Greco now? He's... Another pause, sharper. He split off at Hicks Street, said he was taking a secondary position. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. He's telling Rizzo where you are right now. Roman! Not to her, Caruso pulling his phone away, shouting, Roman, we've got to get down, get... The line didn't go dead, but it went chaotic. Sounds she couldn't fully parse, impact and movement and voices overlapping, and she stood at the mezzanine railing with the phone pressed to her ear and her heart doing something violent in her chest that had nothing to do with accounting and everything to do with the fact that she was 42 floors from the ground in a different context now, and the man on the other end of the line was... One of the 2 security men beside her grabbed her arm. We need to move, he said. Now. What's happening? The building's been made. Someone told Rizzo where we were holding you. He was already pulling her toward the staircase. We need to go. She went. She took the stairs fast, the same heel-to-toe method that had carried her down the service stairwell of Belladonna Trading 3 days ago. And she shoved the phone into her coat pocket without ending the call because she couldn't, because ending the call felt like something final she wasn't willing to do. Ground floor. The security man, she still didn't have his name, she'd never been given his name, moved her through the palletized goods toward the far exit, the one that opened onto the south side of the building. His partner was behind her, covering rear. She heard the front entrance take impact. Not a knock, not a door opening. The specific sound of a door being forced, metal against metal, the industrial complaint of a frame being bent. The security man in front of her broke into a run and she ran with him, and she was aware of how absurd this was, how completely, specifically absurd, a forensic accountant running through a warehouse in the dark for the 3rd time in 72 hours, because she had found the wrong numbers in the wrong ledger on the wrong November night, and had not, even once, taken the option of looking away. She would have thought 3 days ago that she was not the kind of person who made that choice. She'd believed, at 28, that she understood herself precisely, her dimensions, her capacities, her limits. She'd built a life around those measurements, oversized coats and angled monitors and memorized exits, the complete equipment of a woman who intended to survive by being overlooked. She was not overlooked now. The south exit door hit the night air and she came through it at a run, the cold hitting her face like a hand, and the security man had a car, not the black car she'd been riding in for 3 days, a different one, a gray sedan. And the door was open and she got in and the car was moving before she'd fully registered sitting down. Her phone was still connected. She pulled it out. The chaos on the line had changed. Fewer voices, more specific sounds, the concentrated noise of a situation that was either resolving or collapsing, and she couldn't tell which. Caruso, she said, static. Then, here, we're... His voice was rough, cut with exertion. We're clear of the ambush, 2 men down on our side. Rizzo's people retreated. She exhaled. Roman. A pause that lasted 4 full seconds. He's here, Caruso said. He took a hit. Her hand tightened on the phone until she felt the case press into her palm. How bad? He's moving. He's fine. She heard Caruso's voice pull away. Roman, it's her. Say something. A longer pause. Then Roman's voice, rougher than she'd ever heard it, carrying the specific quality of a man working through pain and maintaining control with what was left after the pain took its cut. Still here, he said. She pressed her free hand flat against the car seat and held it there. Where are you? She said. Moving. A pause, the kind that contained effort. The warehouse on Beard Street, 20 minutes. I'll be there, she said. Elara. His voice stopped her before she could lower the phone. She could hear him breathing, not panicked, controlled, but audible in a way that told her the control was costing him. Stay in the car until I call you. Don't go in anywhere alone. Okay, she said. I mean it. I know you mean it. A silence that had a specific texture, the texture of 2 people who had spent 3 days inside a crisis together and had arrived, through that specific compression of experience, at a proximity that had no proper name and no clean professional category. 20 minutes, he said. She rode in the gray sedan through Brooklyn's night streets and watched the city move past the windows and thought about what came next. Not abstractly, concretely, sequentially, the way she thought about everything. Rizzo had moved. Greco had been the second layer of betrayal, the piece she'd identified too late to prevent the ambush. Roman was hurt, but moving. The documentation was complete and in her possession. The variables had changed, but the math hadn't. Rizzo still existed. As long as Rizzo existed, the threat existed. As long as the threat existed, none of the rest of it. Not the documentation, not the resolved internal betrayal, not anything she'd built across 3 days of running and working and refusing to look away, meant anything durable. The warehouse on Beard Street was dark from the outside. She waited in the car until her phone rang. Roman's number, 8 minutes after the call had ended. And then she got out, and the security man walked her to the side entrance, and she went in. Roman was at the far end of the space, standing. She noted that with a specific relief she acknowledged, and then filed, beside a metal support column with Caruso next to him and his jacket off, and a bandage already applied to his left side below the ribs, white gauze with a dark stain at the center that was contained and not spreading, which she read as the best available version of what a gunshot wound looked like. She walked the length of the warehouse. He watched her come. She watched him watch her. The direct, specific attention that she had, over 3 days, entirely stopped finding uncomfortable and started finding something else entirely, something she was not currently in a position to examine. She stopped in front of him. "You're standing," she said. "I told you I was fine." "You told me you were still here. That's not the same thing." Something moved through his expression. It got complicated. Greco. Greco. He said the name with the flat weight she'd heard him use for Dominic that morning, the weight of a word that used to mean something and now meant something entirely different. 2 inside in 1 day. "The financial records will show who else," she said. "I traced Dominic's payments to their origin. The same origin will have payments to Greco if they were running parallel. Give me an hour with the records and I'll tell you if there's anyone else." He looked at her. "You want to work right now. I want to know if there's a third layer before it surprises us the same way the second one did." Caruso made a sound that might have been a short, involuntary acknowledgement of the logic. Roman looked at her for another moment. "There's a laptop in the vehicle," he said to Caruso. "Already on it," Caruso said, and moved. Roman looked back at her. He was close. Closer than the professional distance they'd maintained in her office, in the car, in the apartment's careful furniture arrangement. The distance that had been shrinking by increments across 3 days without either of them formally acknowledging it. She could see the exhaustion in his face clearly from here, the specific depletion of a man who had spent 3 days managing crisis on top of the ordinary load of running what he ran. "You were supposed to stay in the apartment," he said. "I know. You left anyway." "I calculated the risk correctly," she said. "The apartment was a liability." "That's not why you left." She looked at him steadily. He was right, and they both knew he was right, and she wasn't going to lie to him about it, because lying to Roman DeLuca about things he already knew was both inefficient and, she had decided somewhere in the last 72 hours, something she simply didn't want to do. "No," she said. "It's not the only reason." He held her gaze for a moment that was doing something different from the professional assessments that had characterized the first days of their acquaintance. Something that had stopped being about the problem and started being about the 2 people standing on either side of it. Then Caruso came back with the laptop, and the moment folded back into the operational. She sat on an overturned crate and opened the records and started working, and Roman stood above her with his hand on the column and his side bandaged and the whole ruined machinery of a night gone wrong around them. And she ran the numbers because the numbers were what she had and what she knew and what had brought her to this specific warehouse on this specific night. She found Greco's payment thread in 40 minutes. And then she found a third name. She stared at the screen. She looked up at Roman. "Sit down," she said quietly. He looked at her face and sat down. She turned the laptop toward him and pointed to the name in the transfer records. The third node in the shell payment structure, the third person inside his organization who had taken Rizzo's money, the person whose name appeared in the senior organizational records she knew well enough to place immediately. The person who had been standing 3 feet from Roman during tonight's planning session, not Greco. Greco had been the communications leak. The third person was something worse, deeper inside, longer running, with access that made Dominic's access look circumscribed. Roman looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, and she sat across from him in the dim warehouse light and said nothing and let him arrive at the full weight of what was in front of him, because some things couldn't be managed or abbreviated. They had to be sat with. And she had learned across a very long 3 days that the best thing she could do for Roman DeLuca was not try to soften the things that couldn't be softened. Then he looked up, and the look in his eyes was different from anything she'd seen in 3 days of reading him. It was past grief, past the controlled management of betrayal. It was the look of a man who had arrived at the bottom of something and was standing there and deciding, with whatever he had left, which direction was he chose up. She watched him make the decision the way she'd watched him make every decision across the last 4 days, not with declaration, not with visible process, but with the particular quality of stillness that preceded his commitment to a course of action, the moment when everything internal resolved into a single direction and the face went from calculating to settled. He looked at the name on the screen one more time. Then he closed the laptop. "Caruso," he said. Caruso crossed the warehouse floor. Roman turned the laptop toward him, opened it, pointed to the name. Caruso looked at it. Something moved through his face that she had no category for. A combination of things that didn't normally coexist, recognition and disbelief, and the specific grief of a man who had also trusted this person, also shared rooms and plans, and the compressed intimacy of a shared dangerous life. "How long?" Caruso said. 11 months, Ilara said. The first payment traces to 14 months ago, but the first confirmed shell transfer was 11 months. Caruso looked at Roman. "He was at your father's funeral." "I know," Roman said. "He stood next to you at the grave." "Caruso." Roman's voice was quiet, final. "I know." Caruso closed the laptop. He looked at the far wall for a moment, doing the same thing Roman had done. Sitting in the weight of it, allowing it to be what it was, because there was no other way through. Then he straightened and his face went professional. "I know where he is tonight," he said. "He's at the Sackett Street office. He told Greco he was coordinating from there." "He was coordinating Rizzo's people from there," Roman said. "Yes. Take Falco and 2 others." Roman's voice was level and quiet and completely without heat, which was worse than heat would have been. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Caruso looked at him. At the bandage side. At the specific quality of Roman's face, which communicated that the conversation about whether he should be moving tonight was not a conversation that was going to happen. 20 minutes, Caruso said, and moved. Ilara looked at Roman. "You're not going to ask me to stay here," she said. "No," he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd prepared a response. A reasoned sequential argument for why her presence was operationally relevant, the documentation, the evidentiary chain, the ability to present the financial findings in a context that established the full scope of the betrayal. She'd built the argument in the 15 seconds between finding the third name and closing the laptop, the same way she built everything. Fast, structured, anticipating objections. She didn't need it. "The documentation needs to be present," Roman said. "What you found needs to be laid out in front of him directly, no second-hand account." He looked at her steadily. "He'll try to talk his way out of it. He's good at that. He's been doing it for years." "I know how to present evidence," she said. "I know you do." They looked at each other for a moment in the dim warehouse, and she thought about the first morning in her office. The dark-suited stillness of him against her window, the way he'd looked at her like she was a specific problem he was trying to correctly identify. She thought about how different that look was from the one he was giving her now, across 3 days and a gunshot wound, and the complete dismantling of the world he'd thought he was operating in. He'd found the same thing she had, she thought. Not the numbers. Something harder to quantify. The specific discovery of a person you hadn't expected to find in the place you were standing. She picked up the laptop in her coat and said, "Let's go." The Sackett Street office was a converted brownstone in Carroll Gardens. Legitimate face, real business, the kind of operational cover that had been maintained so long, it had developed its own genuine history. The lights were on in the second floor. 2 vehicles out front that Caruso identified with a glance and a brief word to Falco. They went in through the rear. She stayed close to Roman because that was where she'd been told to be and because it was, she had accepted, where she needed to be. Not behind him, not directed by him, beside him, which was a different spatial arrangement than she'd occupied in anyone's life for a very long time. She noted the irony of discovering this particular preference under these particular circumstances and filed it. The interior was what she expected. Working office on the ground floor, operational space above, the building's bones organized around the dual purpose of appearance and reality that characterized everything in Roman DeLuca's world. Caruso had people at both stairwells before they came through the rear entrance. It was organized and fast and carried the quality of something that had been planned before tonight. A contingency already mapped, because this was what Roman's organization did. It mapped contingencies. The man was on the second floor. Felix Moran, 53 years old. The organization's legal and financial liaison. The person who bridged Roman's criminal infrastructure and his legitimate business empire, who managed relationships with the firms and the agencies and the bureaucratic mechanisms that legitimate business required, who had access to every financial system, every legal structure, every operational document that touched both worlds, who had been in the organization for 22 years, who had been in it before Roman, who had been there when Roman's father was alive, who had sat at the old man's right hand during the years when the DeLuca Empire was being built, who had been trusted with the keys to every room in the house. Alara knew his name from the documents. She'd seen it on communications, on legal filings, on the organizational records she'd worked through over the last 4 days. She had not, in 14 months at Belladonna Trading, ever seen his face. She saw it now. I was at a desk when they came in, actually working, actually present over an open laptop and a spread of documents. The performance of diligence, so practiced it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He looked up when the door opened, and his eyes went to Roman first, the immediate gravity of that specific presence pulling attention, and then moved to Caruso, to Falco, and then to her. He didn't know her face. She could see that. The quick scan, the absence of recognition, the eye already moving past her toward the tactical assessment of the room. She set the laptop on the edge of his desk and opened it. Felix Moran, she said. The first payment from Rizzo's account to your shell structure occurred 14 months ago, in the month of September, in the amount of $41,000, routed through a Delaware LLC incorporated under a name variant registered agent that you've used for other legitimate purposes, which is how you hid it in plain sight. She turned the screen toward him. The documentation covers 11 months of confirmed transfers totaling $308,000, cross-referenced against Belladonna's operational shipping schedules and DeLuca organizational communication records, matching outbound intelligence transmissions to Rizzo's network on 17 confirmed occasions. The room was absolutely still. Felix Moran looked at the screen. He took a specific kind of breath. She recognized it, had seen it in her professional life before. The breath of a man who has been caught and is processing the gap between the story he intended to tell and the story the evidence has already told without him. Then he looked at Roman. Roman, he said. His voice was steady. That was the first thing she registered. How steady it was. How completely composed. The voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms with dangerous information and dangerous people and had developed a stillness to rival the man standing across from him. Before this goes any further, I want you to understand something. I'm listening, Roman said. She noted that. Listened to his father. Listened in the apartment when Dominic spoke. Listened now. Roman DeLuca always listened first. She had noted it from the beginning and understood it better now. It was not passivity, it was the operational intelligence of a man who knew that the person speaking first was revealing more than they understood they were revealing. Your father made a deal with Rizzo 4 years ago, Felix said, before he died. A territory accommodation, the waterfront north of Atlantic Avenue, shared access to the Port Authority contacts. Your father agreed to it and I facilitated it, and when he died, the deal died with him because you never knew it existed. Roman said nothing. Rizzo came to me 8 months after the funeral, Felix continued. He said he wanted to renegotiate. He said the terms your father had agreed to should carry forward, that the new leadership's lack of awareness wasn't his problem. And he said, Felix stopped. A pause that she read as calculated, the pause of a man deciding how much of the truth served him. He said he had documentation of your father's agreement, financial records that showed DeLuca money moving through Rizzo channels for 18 months before the old man died. If that became public or reached the wrong investigators, it would have undone everything your father built. The room absorbed this. She watched Roman's face, watched the controlled stillness manage something that was, she understood, larger than anything she'd seen it manage before. Not the betrayal of a lieutenant, not even the betrayal of a trusted operational second, the posthumous implication of his father, the man whose empire he'd inherited and protected and built forward. So you paid him, Roman said. I managed the exposure, Felix said. I made payments to keep those records buried. I fed him operational information that was... I calibrated it, Roman. I gave him things that looked significant but didn't actually damage our core operations. I kept the damage contained. 17 confirmed transmissions, Ilara said. She kept her voice level because the alternative to level was something she didn't want to introduce into this room. Cross-referenced against DeLuca shipping losses and Rizzo operational gains across the same period. The intelligence you transmitted cost this organization approximately $2 million in compromised operations. That's not contained. Felix's eyes cut to her with the specific quality of a man who had now correctly categorized the woman he'd initially looked past. And last night, she continued, the attack on Belladonna Trading, which put 2 armed men in my office and put Roman in a car running from his own building, that came from a sequence you participated in. The Bay Access, the crew chief, the intelligence about building security. That's in the records, too. Felix looked at Roman. I didn't authorize the attack. You authorized the information that made it possible, Roman said. It wasn't supposed to go that far. It went where it went, Roman said, because you built the road. Silence. Felix looked at the laptop screen. He looked at Roman. He made one more calculation. She could see it happening, the rapid processing, the assessment of remaining options. And then something in his face changed in the specific way things changed when a man reached the end of the calculations and found nothing left. Your father would have made the same choice, he said. Quiet. Almost gentle. Roman was very still. I was a pragmatist, Felix said. He understood that survival required accommodation. He would have paid Rizzo, same as I did. He would have managed the exposure, same as I did. You're the one who changed the rules. I didn't change the rules, Roman said. I enforced them. You inherited an organization built on rules you don't actually want to live by. Felix. Roman's voice closed the sentence, closed the room, closed the entire direction of the conversation with the finality of something ending rather than pausing. You built a structure that was designed to survive my discovery of it. The shell corporations, the calibrated intelligence, the financial routing through my own systems. That wasn't protection, that was architecture. You were building something designed to outlast me if I found out. Felix said nothing. The deal my father made, Roman said, whether it existed or not, whether the documentation Rizzo claims to have is real or constructed, that ends tonight. Rizzo ends tonight. He paused. And you end tonight. She had understood this was where the conversation was going. She had understood it from the moment she'd found Felix's name in the payment records. And she understood it now, standing in this room, holding the evidence that had made the conversation possible. She was not naive about what ending meant in Roman DeLuca's world. She did not look away. Caruso moved. Falco moved. Felix stood, and for a moment the room had the kinetic potential of a situation about to become something physical, and then Felix did something she hadn't predicted. He sat back down. He sat back down in his chair and put his hands flat on the desk, and looked at Roman with an expression that had moved past calculation and arrived somewhere she could only read as exhaustion. 22 years, she could see the weight of it in how he sat. Whatever came next, he was done fighting the direction of it. The documentation on my father, Roman said. Where is it? Rizzo's private office. Building on Columbia Street, 3rd floor, physical files. Felix paused. He keeps physical files on everything he considers leverage. He doesn't trust digital. How do you know? Because I've been in that office. A beat. I know the layout. Roman looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Caruso. Get it out of him, he said. Everything about that building. Every detail. He turned toward the door. Roman. Felix's voice caught him. Roman stopped but didn't turn. Whatever you find in those files, whatever your father did, he built something. Don't burn it down trying to make it something it wasn't. Roman stood with his back to the room for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked out. She followed. The night air outside was cold and clear. The rain finally stopped, and she stood on the rear step of the brownstone and breathed it in and let her body process the last hour. Her hands were steady. She noticed them being steady and thought that 3 days ago that would have required significant effort, and now it simply was. the steadiness of a person who had been through enough that steady had become the default, rather than the performance. Roman was standing in the narrow rear passage between the brownstone and the adjacent building, looking up at the slice of night sky visible between the roof lines. She came to stand beside him, not close, the professional distance, the distance she'd maintained for 4 days, and was now, she acknowledged privately, maintaining more from habit than intent. He's right about one thing, Roman said. She waited. My father was a pragmatist. He was looking at the sky. He made accommodations. He did things I wouldn't do. And I spent 18 months after he died trying to run his organization better than he ran it, cleaner, more disciplined. A pause. I thought that was loyalty. It might have been both, she said. Loyalty and its own thing simultaneously. He looked at her. What you're building isn't what he built, she said. That's not a failure. That's just what happens when a different person builds it. He was quiet for a moment. You've been in my world for 4 days. I've been watching it for 14 months. And what do you... He stopped, started differently. What did you see in 14 months? She thought about that. About the rotating cast of dangerous men who moved through Belladonna Trading's steel doors. About the specific quality of attention she'd paid to Roman in those months. The peripheral awareness, the careful catalog of the shape of the thing he was, kept at the safe observational distance of someone who understood the cost of proximity to power. I saw someone who paid his people fairly, she said, who didn't punish errors that were honest errors, who kept his word consistently enough that people believed he would keep it. She paused. In the organization you're running, those are not small things. He looked at her for a moment with the direct, specific attention that had not stopped being disorienting even after 4 days. I also saw someone who trusted the wrong people, she said, which is the same as trusting. You can't have one without the risk of the other. The alley was quiet. Somewhere a few blocks away a car passed, music briefly audible, and then gone. The city ran its own indifferent machinery around them, and she stood in a narrow passage in Carroll Gardens at 10:30 at night with a gunshot wound healing 2 feet to her left and 23 pages of financial documentation under her arm, and thought about the woman who had sat on Danny's kitchen floor 4 days ago with a wet coat and a keychain and no good options. That woman had understood her own dimensions very precisely. She was beginning to think the dimensions had been wrong. They went to Rizzo's building on Columbia Street at midnight. She was not there for that part. She was in the car, this time by choice, rather than direction. She understood the shape of what was happening and understood that her role in it had completed at the point where the evidence had been presented and the direction had been set. The 23 pages had done what 23 pages could do. The rest belonged to people equipped for a different kind of work. She sat in the car and listened to the city and waited. It took 41 minutes. Caruso came back first, then Falco, then Roman, moving carefully, hand at his side, the wound that had been behaving all evening making its objection to the night's total physical demand known in the set of his face. He got in the car and sat and breathed for a moment before he said anything. Done, he said. She didn't ask what done meant. She understood that done was its own complete sentence and that the specific contents of it were not something she needed to carry. The files, she said. We have them. All of them. Everything Rizzo had on my father. He paused. Some of it's real. Some of it's constructed. Felix was right that the original deal existed. The extent of it, another pause. I'll deal with it. She nodded. It doesn't change what I'm building, he said, to himself as much as to her. The quiet assertion of a man drawing a line between what preceded him and what came after. She understood the need for it, the human requirement to name the point where inheritance ended and ownership began. No, she said, it doesn't. They drove back to the apartment. She sat in the back seat and watched Brooklyn move past the windows and felt the specific settling that arrived after the thing you'd been braced against had finally landed and been absorbed. Not relief exactly. Relief implied the absence of cost. And there had been cost. There was still cost. Roman had a hole in his side, and 2 men from his organization were in the kind of trouble that didn't end cleanly, and the landscape of his trust had been restructured in ways that would take a long time to rebuild. Not relief. Something quieter. The particular stillness of the aftermath. In the apartment, she made coffee. It was 1:15 in the morning, and the city glittered below the 42nd floor windows, and she stood at the kitchen counter and made coffee because it was something she knew how to do, something that had nothing in it of danger or calculation. And Roman sat on the edge of the low couch with his jacket off and his bandaged side visible, and watched her do it with the particular quality of attention that she had stopped trying to make comfortable and simply let be what it was. She brought him a cup. She sat in the chair across from him. They drank coffee at 1:15 in the morning after 4 days that had rearranged the architecture of both their lives, and outside the windows the city was exactly what it had always been. Enormous and indifferent and full of people living inside their own specific stories, none of which knew or cared about this apartment, or these two people, or the 23 pages that had changed what the next chapter of this particular story would look like. "What do you want to do?" Roman said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The position, going forward." He held his cup and looked at it. "What I'm going to need is someone who can restructure the financial architecture across the entire operation, not just find what's broken, rebuild what comes after." He paused. "Someone who understands both sides of what this organization is and how the money moves through both." "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm asking what you want." It was, she thought, the more important question, and the more honest version of what he was doing, not offering her something, not positioning her, asking her what she actually wanted in a way that indicated the answer was the variable and not the afterthought. She thought about the accounting wing on the third floor of Belladonna Trading, her corner desk, her angled monitor, her 14 months of practiced invisibility. She thought about the woman who had sat there and found the wrong numbers and had not, despite everything that followed, once wished she had closed the spreadsheet and looked away. She thought about what it meant that she hadn't wished that. "I want to finish what I started," she said. "The Shell Corporation structure needs to be fully unwound and documented. The financial records need to be reconstructed clean across the last 16 months, so there's a clear baseline for what comes after." She paused. "And I want an actual title this time, something that reflects the actual scope of the work." Something happened in Roman's expression that she had, in 4 days of reading him, come to understand as the closest thing he did to uncomplicated. Not a smile exactly, though it was in that territory, but the specific release of the control he maintained so constantly that its brief absence was more visible than its presence. "Done," he said. The months that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be, and they weren't. The financial reconstruction took 11 weeks. She worked through it methodically, the way she worked through everything, sequentially, without cutting corners, documenting every step with the rigor of someone who understood that the clean version had to be real rather than performed. She found 2 additional anomalies that Dominic had embedded in the accounting architecture during his 16 months of parallel operation, smaller than the primary scheme, designed as redundancies, safety valves for diverting funds if the main structure was ever discovered. She dismantled them with the particular satisfaction of work that was exactly the right size for the person doing it. Caruso remained. She had expected him to be the problem. Had prepared for it, actually, the specific friction of a man whose instinct was to distrust the unknown quantity that had arrived in their world and stayed. But Caruso surprised her. He was not warm, and he did not pretend to be, and there was a specific wariness in how he handled her in the early weeks that she respected more than warmth would have been, because it was honest. But by the time March arrived, he was briefing her on organizational financial questions before she asked for them, which was his version, she understood, of acceptance. Danny came to the new office in February and sat across from Ilara's desk and looked at the view of Lower Manhattan and said, "So this is what invisible looks like now." "It looks different," Ilara agreed. "You seem—" Danny studied her. "I'm trying to think of the right word. Not happy, exactly. More like present," Ilara said. Danny thought about that. "Yeah," she said, "present. Like you stopped standing in the back of your own life." She thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, about the specific accuracy of it, the back of your own life, the particular geography of a person who had spent so long making herself small that small had come to feel like the correct size. She thought about this woman who had sat at the corner desk with the angled monitor and the rotating oversized sweaters, and had believed, with the cold precision of someone who'd measured herself carefully for 28 years, that this was the shape that fit. She had been wrong about the shape. In April, Roman's new corporate headquarters opened, a building in Lower Manhattan, glass and steel, the legitimate empire's public face, the cleanest version of what the organization had been building toward for years. There was an event, Not large, not showy, the kind of gathering that the people in the room understood to be significant without needing it performed for an outside audience. She stood at the window on the building's top floor in the early evening, looking out at the harbor and the bridges and the particular quality of spring light on the Manhattan skyline, the city going gold in the last hour before dark. She was wearing a fitted jacket in a deep green that she'd bought 3 weeks ago because it fit the way she actually was, rather than the way she'd spent years trying to appear. She had bought it without deliberation, which was itself a kind of marker. The absence of the calculation that used to accompany every choice about how much space to occupy. Roman came to stand beside her. He'd been across the room. She'd been tracking him with the peripheral attention that had started as professional calibration and become something that didn't have a professional name. And he crossed to her now and stood beside her at the window and looked out at the same view. His side had healed. She knew this because she'd asked, directly, in February, and he'd answered directly, which was the conversational mode they'd arrived at with the naturalness of two people who had first met in a crisis and had never developed the habit of indirection. The controlled stillness was still there. It was constitutive, she'd come to understand, part of the architecture of him. But she'd learned to read what moved underneath it, the specific temperature changes that indicated what the stillness was managing. Right now it wasn't managing anything in particular. He was simply there, beside her, looking at the city. "You found the wrong numbers," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the view. "In November," he said, "you were doing a routine reconciliation and you found the wrong numbers. You could have closed the spreadsheet." "I know." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. The real answer, not the professional one. "Because the numbers asked a question," she said, "and I've never been able to leave a question alone." He was quiet for a moment. "Even when the answer was dangerous." "Especially then," she said. "The dangerous answers are the ones that matter." He turned his head and looked at her, and she let him look. Didn't angle away, didn't find something else to focus on. Didn't perform the smallness that had been her default for so long that she'd mistaken it for her actual dimensions. She looked back. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, running its enormous, complicated machinery, generating its light and noise in the constant churn of a million separate stories, none of them simple, all of them ongoing. The harbor caught the last of the evening sun and held it briefly before the light moved on. "The organization needs a CFO," Roman said. "Not just financial reconstruction, a permanent structural position." "I know," she said. "I've been doing the job for 4 months. Formally," he said, "with the title." And the compensation adjustment that should accompany it. The not-quite smile happened. She caught the whole thing this time, the brief release of control, the unguarded moment that lasted a full 2 seconds before the stillness reasserted. And in those 2 seconds she saw the complete version of it and thought that it was, in the specific catalog she'd been building since November, the detail she'd returned to most. "Negotiated," he said. "Everything is negotiated," she said. They stood at the window while the city went gold and then amber, and then the particular blue-gray of the moment before the lights came on, and she stood in the space she actually occupied. Not the managed small space, not the corner desk space, not the space designed to give nobody a reason to look, and felt the particular quality of a life that had been rebuilt from its actual dimensions, rather than the dimensions fear had recommended. She was not unafraid. She wanted to be accurate about that, because accuracy mattered, and she was constitutionally incapable of telling herself a story that required inaccuracy to hold together. She was not without fear. She had learned, in 4 days in November, what it actually felt like when danger was real rather than theoretical, and she carried that knowledge now the way she carried everything, permanently, precisely, available for reference. But she had also learned that fear and forward motion were not opposites, that you could be afraid and still be the one who pulled the thread, that invisible was a choice, and that the woman who had made it for 28 years had made it out of a particular kind of self-protection that had stopped protecting her a long time before she stopped practicing it. She had found the wrong numbers. The numbers had found her right place. Below the window, New York ran its indifferent, beautiful machinery in every direction, and Alara Voss stood in the light with her actual face and her actual dimensions and looked at it without the oversized coat, without the angled monitor, without the practiced art of disappearing into every room she entered. She had been seen, and she had learned, in the specific school of 4 days that had cost more than anything she'd previously paid for anything, that being seen was not the thing to be afraid of. The thing to be afraid of was the life you built to prevent it. That life was over now. This one, This complicated, dangerous, precisely documented, fully dimensional life had already begun.